Good morning, everybody. And it is such a pleasure to be here this morning. I think my only pity is that we're not in the Eastern Cape with you, but absolutely delighted, though, that we are able to come in over Zoom and hold our very first Eastern Cape regional event. So we've had a couple of events down in Eastern Cape in the last couple of years, but this is the first official one where we are being hosted by our new committee in the Eastern Cape. We haven't actually had an Eastern Cape hub where we've been driven by the region. And so just a huge call out to our new committee. We've got a brand new committee down in the Eastern Cape. We've had a meeting, and I need to tell you that the Eastern Cape committee that are going to be driving our region is just phenomenal. The energy, the drive, we've had the most amazing meeting already. And then so much conversation. They've got a WhatsApp group where the ideas are just flying, and I think you're going to be in very, very good hands. The committee being led by our chairperson, Bridget Mongale from Eastern Cape, and I'm sure very familiar to most of you. And Bridget as well was also the driving member who really said, come guys, we can do this, let's get driving. And then surrounded by these fantastic people, a committee with a lot of energy. And so we're just really looking forward to working with all of you. But now the point is with this fantastic committee, you really do have people in the Eastern Cape that represent you, that you can have conversations with, and really talk about what it is that you as members or non-members or risk professionals in the Eastern Cape, what is it that you need? And I think that's going to be the most important and crucial thing to get the Eastern Cape really going. You know, we've seen over the years with the Institute that we've got, when we've got members in regions that really get things going, that is where things take off and lift off. And we just see huge momentum and an impact on the region. And so I have no doubt that the Eastern Cape is going to be a leading region in a very short time. And hopefully before we know it, we'll be having an event in person down in the Eastern Cape. Because I know for the team and I, we are really, really excited to be working with all of you and actually to come down and be there. Our head office for IRMSA is in Sandton in Johannesburg. So you can imagine that we really would rather be down in the Eastern Cape this morning with you. But here we are. So thank you very much and good luck to this committee. You guys are phenomenal. I know that the team here are absolutely loving working with you, with your energy, your thought leadership and input. So thank you very, very much. So before we get going this morning, I would really like to thank Eastern Cape Treasury. Eastern Cape Treasury have sponsored and partnered with IRMSA this morning to ensure that we are able to bring this event to you. And it's, you know, and looking at the lineup for this morning and the topics and the speakers, it is really a fantastic program. And I do know that we've got people, so Eastern Cape, we've got, you know, we've got members that have snuck in from other regions because the program is so solid. So although we're reflecting on the year past with COVID, and what a year has this been, I'm sure you'll all agree with me. It's like, sure. And I cannot believe that, you know, we're sitting today the 1st of December, and it just seems so surreal. But as we reflect on COVID-19, the impact of this pandemic, and particularly in the Eastern Cape, I know as risk professionals that even though we're talking more about the Eastern Cape this morning, it really, you know, the lessons learned and so on, that all of us as members from all over South Africa, there's members from Africa and even Europe that will be joining us, and we'll be able to learn so much from each other. And I think at IRMSA, that is what we do best, is that we, you know, we've got programs, we've got training programs, we've got events and webinars and so on. But where we learn most as risk professionals is from each other in terms of the networking, engaging with other professionals, communicating. And I think that is one of our key drivers, is that communication, because that as a professional, in terms of how to communicate and engage with our organizations, is through strong communication and finding our voice, that people really are open to listening to us. So what I do find is with sessions like this, is that personally, and I know with many of our members, is that this is where we learn, this is the platform where we really learn how to get the message across effectively, how to communicate the message, and how to make the impact on our organizations and our own landscape. So So this is going to be the start of wonderful things and wonderful discussion platforms. So this morning, after I've handed over and done my welcome, I'll be handing over to our new chairperson, Bridget, who's going to be facilitating during the day. There'll be 4 presentations and then a fantastic panel session. So I think you've just got a morning of wonderful gems that you're going to be able to take back to your organizations and back to your workplaces and really, make a difference, start having the conversations. And I think, as an institute, we find that where our members or people become involved and they start having the conversations, that is where we start seeing the traction and that momentum that is so well needed. And so the conversations need to start today. I know we've got members, we've got non-members this morning. The non-members may want to consider joining as a member. Obviously, as an institute, we're the professional body for risk management in South Africa. And our drive is to build our membership base, purely because what it means is that the more risk professionals that we have as members and going through and building their designations that are registered with the South African Qualification Authority, the more credibility that we can build in the country for the profession of risk management. So that is the biggest objective, is to ensure that people, organizations are sitting up and taking the risk professionals and the profession very seriously, so that you are able to make the impact and do what you really need to do. And so the more that we can build and work together, if we can get that right, then we're on the way to building a stronger, not only organizations, but a stronger South Africa economy and a landscape where we can really see the country start to flourish. And I think that is just imperative right now. So as we move through this morning, I'd love you to think of questions that you can ask all the speakers, and they'll be in the panel later, and it'll be well facilitated. So you'll be using the chat box, and you can chat, and we've got people that will either answer or they'll save the questions for the panel. But use this time to ask the questions, and then not only do you need to use the chat box this morning for questions to the speakers in the panel, but if I could also ask you, if you've got questions about the institute, if you are new to our space and you'd like to know what we do or how you register for certain things, or you've got a question, my team is on standby, and they'll also be answering questions on the chat box as well. So really use the chat box, because you won't be able to ask the questions in person or out loud. So that chat box is really your voice this morning. So just quickly, when we reflect on this year from an IRMSA point of view, as most of you know, everything became digital. It was quite a journey, and there's nothing in IRMSA that we didn't touch with the virtual world. So from our events such as our webinars, our training, our board exams, our risk support, everything has gone digitally. And so for next year, we've seen that this is definitely a winning recipe in many areas, but we do know that we're missing that human touch. So we will be looking at hybrid events where we'll have the in-person and the digital event linked, and particularly also with training and so on. I mean, there've been some great things that we've seen. So for example, people not having to travel from regions to come to Santon or so on, or where it's a meeting. I mean, we've never had so many amazing meetings with a full house of committee members. And we've just seen how this is a huge positive and an opportunity, which is wonderful. We will be doing some training and events in the various regions, but what is wonderful is that we can link into each other's regions via this digital world that has brought so much. Our conference next year, which will be end of September, early October, again, we found that the digital conference was fantastic. We didn't expect it to be such a great success, but it was really, really awesome. And so we're going to have the digital and in person. So depending on what kind of person you are, that you're thinking, oh, I really wish to be there in the flesh, or you know what, I'm very happy to link in from my office or my home and follow the stream, then that'll be great. So we'll be sharing all of this. And obviously it all depends on the landscape next year with COVID-19 and where we find ourselves. But in our mind's eye, this is where we're going. This is what we're planning for. But as an institute, I'm sure you know, and those of you who know as well, we've always got our plan B, C, D, E. So that'll be for 2021. And then, of course, it's something that I'm going to urge. I spoke about credibility earlier, and it's about building your own credibility. And we've seen, actually, which was amazing for me this year, was more registrations for our board exams. So to build designations. So we had more people writing board exams in 2021 during this disaster year than we did in 2020. And so I was completely blown away. And I think that is something that you need to consider for your 2021 year for board exam 1, which is your CRM prac, or board exam 2, which is your CRM prof. So depending on your level and your experience in risk management, we would be able to help you determine where you would slot in. But I think next year, especially what we've seen, and I'm sure we're going to talk this morning in terms of, the reflections, I have seen more and more this year in terms of the importance of the role of the risk professional, the importance of risk management within organizations at each level, at every level, understanding where risk management would fit in right from the beginning, from strategy and throughout the engagements and projects and with what we're doing. And then, but it takes, and I always speak about the 4 C's, and it used to be 3 C's, and the 3 C's were, you need to have conviction in your roles as a risk professional. You need to have the courage, because sometimes it's the hard conversations, and the charisma, and that's what I spoke about in terms of finding your voice and how to get messages across without alienating the entire world. Because sometimes the risk profession, when we walk down that corridor, they're like, oh God, here comes the bad news, So those are the 3 C's, but then we added in a 4th C that is important, and that is that credibility. And so you need to be able to speak with, when we speak with conviction, to have that credibility and to be able to say, I've got this designation and this is how I got here. They do sit up and take you seriously. So please consider that for next year. And then, of course, with whatever risk support that you may need, please, look to IRMSA. We do have we've got an amazing technical capability with not only our chief risk advisor, but with our members. That the way we operate it in IRMSA is that everything we do is for the members, by the members. And so the chief risk advisor with the Center of Excellence has a panel with members that sit in there that can support each other. And I think that is where you can also just gain so much through your IRMSA membership. And then, of course, the technical library, where members can go on at any time for free and just access. You need to be a member. It's only members only. It's a members only club to get into the technical library. So for me, that is really well worth it. So much for you to think about as you're going through this morning. I know that you've got so much to think about as you're planning for your 2021. I can't believe that we planned, we're doing budgets and so on for next year, for our new financial year in March. It's just crazy to think that we're already here, but we are here. So we need to ensure that we really get things right for next year. I think for next year as well is that if we do go into a second wave and a further lockdown of some type, we've got so many lessons learned. There's so much we've learned. There doesn't need to be that frantic scrabble to get things, everything in place again, because we've been there, done that. We've got the T-shirt, we've got the lessons learned. We know how to do this. So this is our role as risk professionals to really make sure that we've got our ducks in a row for next year. And then the what else, what could be. So we're worrying about the pandemic, we're worried about COVID, but what could be the other pandemic next year? And I think these are the questions we need to ask. So before I just get carried away talking about this even more, again, thank you to Eastern Cape Treasury. Bridget, you're a phenomenal chairperson already, great lead for this region. And we're so looking forward to this morning. So with that, I'm going to hand over to your chairperson for the morning, Bridget. I'm going to hand over to you, but our team is here. We're ready to support you. And I just think everyone have a really great morning and enjoy just all the learning and lovely stuff. Bridget, are you ready? You need to unmute. That's the phrase of the year. You're good, Bridget.
Yes. Thank you so much. Thank you, Gillian, and good morning to everyone. Warm welcome to our first digital event, being the second risk event for the Eastern Cape region. Before we could start, my name is Bridget Mukhali. I'm employed by Provincial Treasury. I've got a few ground rules that I would like to set before we can continue. And also I am a chairperson for the IRMSA Eastern Cape Committee. The program is 4 hours long. Each session will take around 25 minutes with a panel discussion at the end of the day. We hope we'll be able to interact. You may send your question or your comment on the chat box. Unfortunately, everyone will be muted because there won't be any verbal interaction. However, the chat box is available to communicate. There is a capable, dedicated team waiting for you to send those messages so they can interact with you. Lastly, please use hashtag live with IRMSA at all platforms, social media. There is a team that is waiting to interact with you regarding this webinar and taking the conversation further. The last one, there is a survey that will be posted on the chat box. Please click on that, complete the survey so we can get a feedback in terms of how we're doing, do we need to improve, and how are the session in general. As Gillian has said, many thanks as well. Heartfelt thanks to the Eastern Cape Provincial Treasury for making this opportunity possible. Now, having set those ground rules, let's welcome our first opening keynote speaker, who is the Director General in the Eastern Cape Provincial Administration, Mr. Mbulelo Sokoni. Is not new to this position in the Eastern Cape Provincial Administration. As you might know, he comes armed with impeccable record of being a former Alfredo MED executive mayor. He's also a member of the legislature. He's been an MEC of a number of provincial departments, also a former Director General and former Premier of the Eastern Cape. Wow. So he's been around. He knows what this administration is all about. He holds a master's degree in public administration, a Bachelor of Science and Higher Education diploma. He hit the ground running during the difficult times when the province and the country faces the coronavirus 2019 global pandemic. Premier Mabuyane is confident that Mr. Sokoni's capabilities as a well-rounded strategist, he's skilled and talented in the administration as an administrator, will strengthen the provincial government effort to stabilize the provincial administration and advance the province vision 2030 to build the new Eastern Cape that we all want to see. Having said that, I believe that when we knocked at the door, when we asked the Director General to come and be our keynote speaker, that is a gesture to say, I am with you. I am ready to listen to the risk practitioners of this province. I am setting a tone to a clean administration and good governance. And we don't take that lightly. Siyabulela Tata kakhulu for giving us this opportunity and accepting to be a keynote speaker. I'm going to hand it over to you to give us what you want us to share with us, and also reflecting on the COVID-19, defining this new normal, and how then do we move in moving forward. You've got 25 minutes and the stage is yours. Ladies and gentlemen, let's welcome our DG of the province.
Thank you very much, Bridget, and good morning, colleagues. Thank you for that intro, and thank you for the opportunity as well. I would also wish to acknowledge Gillian, the CEO of IRMSA. It really is a good platform that you have created with the risk practitioners in the province, and I'm really honored to be part of this session. I must admit, though, that a bit embarrassed that I've not had the opportunity to meet the committee led by Bridget. I'm only getting to meet with them at this platform, and thanks to COVID-19 in that regard. The day really coincides with the commemoration of the World AIDS Day. And as we know, it's one other pandemic that we have had to be confronted with over time, and that we have not defeated to date, is still raging on. But little did we know that another was in the making, and it has hit our shores very hard, and that being the coronavirus pandemic. I would really wish to deal a little bit with what's happening in the Eastern Cape in that regard. And maybe I'll just pose a few questions in terms of what is it that I think we need to be considering going forward. May I then ask that we get to the next 2 slides? Just go to that summary. The next slide of the summary. Yes. Just as an indication that in the province, in the midst of that which was developing in the horizon, beginning to see infections coming up elsewhere in the world and in the country, we also developed our own COVID-19 strategy. And lately we have refined that to be taking the form of a resurgence plan, a resurgence mitigation plan, I'm sorry. The second point I'm making is just about the inclusive nature of our strategy and plan, which really helped a lot in terms of bringing everybody and every stakeholder on board in the work that we needed to do. I'm also indicating that the critical risks for us really being that of the effect of this on the public health profile of the province as a whole, and that with its knock-on effects on the ability of government to focus and deliver on the expectations of the electorate. And secondly, the issue about whether or not we will still be able to perform against the targets that we set ourselves. And in particular, we got worried about the effect of this on basic and higher education. We got worried about the pressure that this was putting to bear on our healthcare resources, the government business continuity in general, as I will demonstrate later, but as well as the stagnation in economic growth in our country, and not that different from what is happening elsewhere in the world, but I think we are feeling the pinch of it. I'm also highlighting the point that now we're working on this risk-adjusted interventions to try and contain the virus, and especially in light of the festive season that's coming. May I move to the next slide? The next slide again. We're just showing here what the numbers look like, and that's the country as a whole as at yesterday, and we're indicating on the left-hand side of the slide that the Eastern Cape stands at just over 128,000, and if you're looking at in comparative terms, we really, yes, number 4, but we really have caught up on KwaZulu-Natal. There was a gap quite recently, but that has been significantly eroded and minimized now. We were at 78,000 just on the 1st of August, and it tells you what has happened in just a few weeks since then. If we may move to the next slide. On the next slide, we're just indicating this 128,000 that we're talking about. Yes, we have scored quite a significant amount of recoveries, but of course we have lost people in the process, and that number 1,550 is quite worrisome, because those are people who are currently in hospital. Yes, the recovery rate, has been commendable, but in recent times we have been around 95% and so on. And if you're looking at it now, we are really regressing in terms of that recovery. The second point about healthcare workers is very important, especially for the session of today. Because again, as you look at those numbers, in terms of the extent of infections as well as death, led by health, led by education, but also what is happening now is you see social development coming up strongly as well. And that talks to the extent to which our frontline workers are exposed to these infections and death. If we move to the next slide. This picture is just focusing on the resurgence. If you're looking on your extreme right, you see that from week number 42 in the main, the curve just sharply went up. And by week number 44, week number 46, as you see it, those two ones, the Nelson Mandela one, the green one, and the Sarah Baartman one, being the brownish one, they really caused a big scare amongst ourselves, because I think all along we were under the impression that everything was really under control until we got to that week number 42, when it turned out to be like that. But as you can see now, again, it's beginning to go down, but I think it would be too early to conclude as such. Next slide. In terms of the strategy, I'll just fly through that. Next slide, please. I'll just fly through this. At the beginning, we really developed a strategy that was intended to make sure that we contain the virus, not allowing it to spread. Secondly, that we needed to protect our vulnerable communities. Thirdly, we needed to find sustainable solutions for our health system. And fourthly, to make sure that our economy gets to be saved, and as well as it recovers from the effects of the pandemic. Those were the four fronts on which we were dealing with the work on this pandemic. Next slide. Same thing, but presented differently in terms of our approach. Next slide. We then got to this resurgence stage that I referred to. And this is what represented the picture then that we got to see. As you can see, it's quite a scary picture in terms of those colors. The areas where we felt really we were significantly exposed, as well as the areas where a lot of work had been done, and therefore it was work in progress, if you like. It was just a matter of making sure that we maintained certain things that we needed to maintain, and improve further from that. Then, as you can see, a very isolated green color in terms of the area where we were of the view that significant progress had been made. There was no possibility of turning back in terms of that. But with others, it depended on the magnitude of the problem. We could still find ourselves in trouble, although we had thought we had made significant progress. And I may just add that that was at the time when we were moving down from level 5 of the lockdown to 4 and so on and so on. And then we reached 1. And then our guards began to go down because we thought everything was under control. Next slide. The matters that are of critical concern to us that I would like to pose as well for this session to think about, because we really would want to invite suggestions on some of this. The first one is that in general, there appears to be an apparent lack of awareness about and inadequate profiling of the risks brought about by COVID-19. I think we talk about it. I don't think we have a comprehensive picture and a picture in totality of what are we dealing with. What are the effects of this that we are dealing with? And I think it's work that the practitioners here may just want to think about. How can they help government in the main to compile and present us with that comprehensive picture, so that we don't act like we're looking at things of today. We're not looking at them in totality. We just ignorant about what's happening tomorrow. And therefore, planning for all of those things has to be based on the risks that would have been sufficiently identified and profiled. The next point. Clearly now, the timing for, the next point. The timing of this resurgence is very opportunistic, because Eastern Cape is a migrant labor province. And at this time is when most people ordinarily would be traveling to the Eastern Cape for holidays. And if you take that into account, we have a problem. Because the opportunistic nature of coronavirus, it has to do with movements of people. And with this movement coming, it's likely to help. And I may just want to add on this point that unfortunately, there are things that if we fail to do in the Eastern Cape now, in the next 2 weeks up to about 14th of December, if we fail to do those things and successfully contain the virus, we unfortunately getting the entire country into trouble. And therefore, we just can't fail in the next 2 weeks to achieve in really containing the spread of the virus. I'm also making the point about social behavior being the main problem that we faced with. Look, colleagues, I'm not suggesting that we couldn't have done more and better as government, but I think we played our part. But I think it has reached the point now where, as the president would say, it is now in our own hands. Our communities have to play their roles. I will demonstrate it in a few minutes. The next point is in relation to the public health system. Truth be told, public health in South Africa in general, but in particular in the Eastern Cape, was not ready for this that we came across or found ourselves into. And the situation became worse and worse. However, our response, I think, has been well. I think we have tried the best we could to make sure that we put in place renovated hospitals and clinics, new hospital beds. There is oxygen where there was no oxygen. I think we have done well in that regard, but we are not out of the woods yet. In terms of government continuity, I'm just flagging a few points. The one point is that there is the biggest likelihood that most government institutions may not be able to catch up on their performance plans. And that says a lot in relation to the expectations of the communities out there. The second point is in relation to the economic stagnation, that if it continues, surely it has significant impact or implications for our fiscal environment. And as we would have seen in just last week, when in the province we were presenting our adjustment budget, being 3 billion rand less than what we ordinarily would have been had we not had those budget cuts, is a significant development, and it can't be ignored. The other point, it relates to the continued exposure of our frontline workers to infection. As I indicated, they really are getting infected. They really are getting to die. Now, the last point I'm making, which again would be a major concern for the risk practitioners, relates to our continuing loss of public trust due to the perceptions or reality, excuse me, of PPE tender corruption. It's bad. We will struggle over time to rid ourselves of this because it has come to stick. Next slide. Next slide. On this slide, I'm merely pointing. No, I'm sorry. The first one. On this slide, I'm merely pointing at the fronts on which we're trying to contain the virus. I won't get into detail, hoping that it would be shared with the participants in this. The next one. This is just the detailed work that we are doing, which we are hoping that if we could succeed in dealing with this work, it will go a long way in terms of our efforts to contain the virus. Let's go to the concluding slide. I'm just concluding here, colleagues, by pointing out that this is a job for all of us. In our own little corners, as I pointed out earlier, we need to be asking ourselves, what can we contribute to the work that we do now during the COVID-19 period, but also in trying to rebuild beyond COVID-19. And therefore, for the risk practitioners, it's going to be important that we pose that question to ourselves, as well as try to find answers to that question. Some of the work that we need to do, yes, is internal within government, but also we need to think about our own communities. Our communities are devastated. We need to find solutions to how do we build those communities and bring about social cohesion again. The last point I would want to make is that which has to do with government, as I said earlier on, has become exposed. We need then to be asking the question, how do we repurpose government taking into account these experiences? Because it would be that, in my view, there is coronavirus now. We don't know if the coronavirus will really be gone anytime soon. And we don't know if it's gone, that it will be gone forever. And therefore, we may as well then pick up those lessons and be able to say, how do we taking into account these lessons, make sure that we repurpose the state. We make the state to be relevant even at times like the times that we are going through. Now, we may be moaning about the fact that today, as an example, we are meeting through this virtual platform. But should it not really be that going forward, we think about ways in which we embrace these developments like what we have today, because they could help us interact much more frequently and with less cost. Now, secondly, could it not be that even at a service delivery level, there are certain things that we could innovatively think about that could make sure that our communities interface with government a lot easier and better by, for example, investing on connectivity, on making sure that there is technology available at the level of our communities. Now, those are some of the things that we need to think about. But the point I'm making is, without you, colleagues, and the suggestions that you make, we will go into these things, blindfoldedly. We will go into these things without prior thought about them and be able to pick on the issues that we need to be fully aware of as we get into these matters. Bridget and colleagues, I would want to conclude there. I would want to leave you to ponder those questions and help us in the end with suggestions and recommendations on what is it that you think we can do better and differently. Because clearly, it's not about Premier, it's not about Director General, it's not about, I think it's about all of us coming together and looking at what best ways can we offer to take our province and the country forward. Thank you very much for the opportunity. Thank you very much for listening to me, colleagues. Thank you.
Thank you so much, DG. We really appreciate your time, your effort, and we do take into account the question that have been posed indeed that needs to be answered. The whole idea is how then do we move forward? And I believe and hope that amongst the other speakers, as they'll be delivering their speech as well, maybe they'll be able to touch a little bit on what you said, especially in the side of the economy, and how then do we deal with the issue of the communities as well. As you've rightfully mentioned, that it takes all of us. As much as risk management is everyone else's responsibility, so is COVID-19. We all have to play our respective role in ensuring that we come out of this pandemic as much as possible without going further the damage that is being done in moving forward. DG, before I let you go, there is a hand that I've noticed. Sitelo, I think I would like the facilitator to assist and open their mic. I'm going to take that question. I haven't seen any hand. The rest, they may continue to pose the comments they have on the chat box. And I believe that the questions that have been posed, when we go into the part where we'll be dealing with the panel, let's try to unpack and provide recommendation and provide hope. How then do we conquer this pandemic in moving forward? Thanks. Can I ask the hand that has been up, Sitelo, please, may you ask the question before we let the DG?
I have opened Sitelo's mic. You just need to unmute in order to ask the question live.
Hello. Hello.
Hello, yes, you may ask the question.
Am I audible?
Yes, 100%, I can hear you.
Okay. A very good morning to everyone who's present. A very good morning to the DG himself, and also to the leadership of the province that is attending this session. Let me first of all appreciate the invitation that we've received from within the department. I'm from the Department of Cooperative Governance and Traditional Affairs. I'm within the Strategic Planning Unit, and I'm also part of the risk team within the department, working or contributing as a risk champion. My question would be to the DG. considering the fact that the fiscals of the province has been cut tremendously under the COVID-19 pressures. Now, I'm thinking of a situation whereby there may be other projects that are in place and have been planned for within this current financial year. Are there probably any plans that are there probably with Treasury and National Treasury to make sure that basically those projects that have been in continuity are able to be implemented and sustained, as they should assist also in curbing some of the challenges that we are having around COVID-19. Thank you very much.
Thank you for the question. DG, are you still there? Are you able to respond to the question?
Yes, Bridget, I will attempt, and thank you very much, Stella, for the for that question, and I think it's a valid concern. Look, our assessment, Stella and colleagues, has been that much of that which we are not going to achieve during this financial year really may not be that much about the budget cuts. It may really have more to do with the fact that there isn't much implementation that happened during the first 2 quarters of the financial year. There really are significant projects that could not take off the ground as they were meant to as of the beginning of the financial year. And some of those projects are only now, being started. And if you're looking then at what needs to be achieved through those projects in terms of the milestones that were set, we are not likely to have delivered in those projects come the end of the financial year. The budget cuts, we directed the budget cuts more towards, if I may say, the compensation of employees basket, by looking at what are the things that we can try and not do. Not that is the best way to do, but in the circumstances. And then we identified those areas. I'll just make a few examples without taking your time, Bridget. When we looked, colleagues, at the fact that, yes, we wanted to appoint employees into the system, and we were like, okay, if we allow this employment in this manner, what is it saying to us over the MTF period when we know that the likelihood is that we would have lost 26 billion by the over the MTF period? And therefore, it may not be sustainable. And we just needed to confront it and say, let's start controlling it now, rather than allowing it only to retrench people at some point. Then the second example I would want to make would be over things like, as you would have noticed in government, sometimes we don't do work at the time when we're supposed to do work. We do work in what is called overtime work with the expectation of overtime pay. Eliminate all of those things so that it's really about protecting salaries of people so that going forward, people can still be employed in government rather than enjoying overtime pay and all of those things that may, in effect, over time shorten the span of employment in the public service because retrenchments may be looming. I'm then saying that those are the items that we kind of targeted, and we do not think, and I'm not saying they will not have an impact on service delivery, they will. But I'm just saying, we do not think, though, of the projects that were planned in 2019-20, they will suffer that much as a result of those interventions that we have made. Colleagues, my parting shot is, when you are confronted with a situation where you have to make choices, it does happen sometimes that those are not the best of choices, but in the circumstances, they become the best choices that you could make. In this case, we have been confronted by that, where we needed to make some choices. Do we allow it to go, because we are fearful of making those decisions? And we reminded ourselves that in any event, time will come when we look back, say to ourselves, we missed an opportunity to contain this. Those are just the choices that we needed to make. Bridget and colleagues, thank you very much. It would have been good to stay on the platform and listen to the discussions, but unfortunately, that is not going to be possible. Thank you very much, Bridget and colleagues. Thank you.
Thank you so much, DG. And thank you for the response that you have provided. Unfortunately, due to the time factor, colleagues, we won't be able to take any further questions. However, you may make use of our chat box. Your question will be answered when we'll be dealing with the panel discussion later. We are considering the time constraint as well for some of our speakers. They've got other engagement, but we do thank you, DG, for your time as well in answering. And I like your answer that you gave. It seems like more like risk management. It confronts you with a situation, what would happen, so you may take an informed decision in moving forward. I mean, that is practically what risk management is all about, to give you information for you to make an informed decision to reduce or protect yourself against further impact of the negative that might happen. Without any waste of time, we are going to be allowing our second speaker for the day, Chris Holdsworth, who is an investment strategist. Chris is responsible for investment strategy at Investec, Wealth and Investment. He sits globally on the committee that comes up with the risk score for investing over the following 12 to 18 months. I mean, it's so much futuristic. The local asset allocation committee, that's where he's also saving, which he heads, then use that risk score combined with the SA specialist factor up with the SA risk score and make recommendation on asset allocation. That sounds to me like so much of risk management in practice. You see it live, you practice it more or less day to day. He also provides research input to both committee of covering the domestic macro factors linking it with the financial market. Let's welcome our second speaker who's working for Investment Tech, that is Chris Holdsworth. Chris, the stage is yours.
Great, thanks very much. Hopefully everybody can hear me. I'm going to attempt to share a screen and run through a presentation covering what are our macro views for South Africa in particular. But in order to form a view on South Africa, one needs to have a view on what's happening globally as well. The time is quite constrained. I've been given instructions to complete it by about 1:45 or so. So I'll keep an eye on the time and we won't run over too far. But there's a lot to talk about. Clearly, there are many moving parts globally. So what I've done is I put a summary of what we consider to be the key moving parts at this point. And we'll have a run through. Unfortunately, we do have to start with the virus because it is still very significant. But we won't spend too much time on it. And then we'll get into some of the nitty-gritty about South Africa in particular towards the end. But just starting on the virus, the chart on the left is the 7-day average. The red line is the 7-day average number of new infections. It's sitting at about 570,000 infections per day globally, which is fairly significant. There are about 10,000 deaths per day globally as well. But it's very encouraging to note that that red line has started to roll over already. So while we're in this third wave, it does appear that there is some light at the end of the tunnel, and we're starting to see declines fairly week on week. The US numbers have started to roll over, although again, Thanksgiving may have had a part in that. But generally across Europe, we're seeing an improvement in the numbers. And so it does seem that we might be through this. The chart on the right is a number of countries that have more than a specific number of infections per day on average over the past 7 days. And you're looking at close to 30 countries that have more than 3,000 infections per day, the 7-day average. South Africa is about to join that group. So it's pretty widespread. It is pretty global. And as a result, we've had lockdowns in a number of countries. And the question now becomes, when can we expect those lockdowns to be eased, on the basis that it will only happen once the virus starts to roll over? We can use data to try and get an answer to that. The chart on the left is the number of people that have been hospitalized in ICUs in various European countries, and the chart on the right is total beds occupied by confirmed COVID cases in England. The issue is that you don't have countries reporting in a similar fashion. England reported in one way, European countries reported another way, Germany reported in a separate way, and then the US reported in a different way as well. So we've collated as best we can. And what one can see is, post the decline in the number of infections in France and Belgium, we're already seeing a decline in the number of people occupying ICU beds. And that's critically important because the lockdowns come about to increase healthcare capacity. And we're already seeing that that need is starting to diminish. It's true in the UK as well. It's less true in the US. Their numbers for hospitalizations continue to grow. In South Africa, we do have a second wave brewing. We're looking at just below 3,000 infections per day. It's up 20% week on week. It's encouraging that the growth rate at this point is slower than what we saw in our first wave, but there does seem to be a second wave underway. And we know that particularly focused in the Eastern Cape and the Western Cape, and we may hear more about that later this week, about restrictions that are being posed. Having said all that, we can keep track of the high frequency data and where we are. It doesn't tell us a lot about what's going to be happening next year or the year after. And for that, we are quite fortunate. The cavalry is arriving. There are 9 vaccines that are currently in stage 3 trials. We've had results on 4 of them so far coming through. None of them have yet been signed off formally, but we're not far off from that. There are indications that the UK will sign off this week already on one of the vaccines, and they have purchased some already ahead of it being signed off. And they're starting to distribute it to frontline healthcare workers on December 7th, assuming everything gets cleared this week. And based on the pipeline that we've seen for these manufacturers and for the countries that have put in their orders, by the end of next year, about 85% of developed market citizens will be vaccinated. And that includes assumptions about some people not wanting to be vaccinated and wanting to wait to see what the side effects are, or generally just being anti-vax. The point being that these issues that we got about lockdowns and in Europe in particular and in the US and the potential for second wave, those are short-term considerations. Hopefully by this time next year, COVID will be a thing of the past, and we need to be focusing on what's going to be happening for the South African economy and the global economy as we transition from lockdowns and these severe restrictions on mobility into a more normal environment. The vaccine will ensure that the virus is temporary, but some of the things that we're doing around that from an economic perspective will have longer lasting consequences. An example of how the vaccine will affect our mobility is shown in this chart. This is based on tracking data from Google. They monitor all of our cell phones. They know where we are, and they map that against an inventory of locations. They know how much time we spend in retailers, how much time we spend in parks, how much time we spend at home, how much time we spend in transit, how much time we spend at work. They've got access to all of that information for pretty much every country in the world, except for China and Russia, where they don't allow that information to be displayed. And we can delve into that data and we can extract what we find to be useful. So we look at the amount of time that people spend in retailers, in transit, and at their workplace as a general indicator of activity. And here we can see a few interesting things. First of all, South Africa is a yellow line. We did have a stricter lockdown than most of the rest of the world. Categorically, we can pick it up through the data. We were spending more time at home than pretty much any other grouping of countries, whether it be the global median, emerging markets, developed markets, or I've just put in the UK as an example. But things have changed materially since then. Developed markets, because of the second and third wave, as appropriate for given countries, has come about, you've seen a reduction in their mobility, increasing restrictions. So they're actually rolling over. Emerging markets have been improving, South Africa amongst them. And at this point, we have one of the easiest set of restrictions, one of the loosest set of restrictions of any country in the world. Far more severe restrictions as we speak in parts of the US, in the UK, in Europe, even in China at this point, and various other countries than we're seeing here. So the narrative of South Africa imposing a stricter set of restrictions than the rest of the world was true for about a month, but it's no longer true. Once we get back to normal, we would presume that most of these series go back towards baseline, back up towards zero. And these series correlate very strongly with GDP. And that tells us actually, based on the tracking data, that growth at this point for Q4, as we speak now in South Africa, is higher than for a number of other emerging markets and higher than for a number of other developed markets. And there has been a fairly swift recovery in South Africa relative to the rest of the world. We're still below zero, but we are recovering more rapidly than elsewhere, unless we go and get another set of restrictions. Okay. So onto that medium time horizon. This is a chart showing expected growth over the coming 3 years, and I've ranked it by cumulative growth over those 3 years. And there are a couple of interesting things that come out. At the top, you've got China. China is expected to grow by 2% this year. They're the only G20 country that's going to be up from a GDP perspective this year. That in itself is astounding. But have a look at their growth for next year. These are consensus forecasts. China is expected to grow by 8% next year and by 5.5% the year after. Any companies and countries that have hitched their wagon to China are experiencing good times. An example of that would be our export sector. If you're exporting minerals and you're exporting iron ore to China, China is sucking in iron ore, copper, all sorts of minerals from the rest of the world. So again, anybody who's a player on China is doing well as a result of the massive recovery we're seeing in China. And the recovery is coming about because of huge stimulus that's been applied, and they just locked down the country completely in February. And as a result, they seem to have knocked a lot of the virus. So they don't have a resurgence. They never really had a second wave. And when there is a second wave, they go and test a whole city's population just to go and crush it. So China growth very strong. A bit further down, you've got the US. They're going to be down about 4% this year and up about 4% next year. So by the end of next year, they recover everything that they've lost this year. And that also partly comes about because of massive amounts of stimulus being thrown around. Europe, the picture's a bit more dire, down a bit more this year, only up 5% next year, then only up, call it 3% the year after. So it takes Europe 2 years to recover what they've lost this year. And then you've got South Africa right down near the bottom, down about 8.5% this year, but only up about 3 and a bit the year after, then up to, it takes South Africa 3 years to recover. So China's recovered already. The US expectations are it'll take 1 year. Europe, it'll take 2 years. South Africa, it will take 3 years. And it points to the binding constraints on growth that we have in South Africa. Electricity as an example. But there are others too. The fact that the government is far more fiscally constrained than in a number of these other countries and is less able to provide the sort of stimulus that we've seen elsewhere. In terms of where China is at this point, they're already massively in front. The chart on the left is industrial production, year-on-year growth, and you can see they overtook pretty much the rest of the world around March. At this point, industrial production is up 7% year-on-year in China. It's a massive number. It's still down everywhere else. Retail sales growth has been slower to grow in China, but it is still growing. And we can see because of the second and third waves, the numbers are actually starting to roll over in Europe and the US. So within a couple of months, from a growth perspective, China will be leading the world for industrial production and, in fact, retail sales as well. And that's significant because it affects global trade. And this is what's so interesting. Despite the fact that a number of countries are still down year on year, global GDP at this point is still down probably about 4% year on year. Global trade is at a record high. If you measure it by the number of containers that are moved around ports around the world, it's at a record high. If you measure it in terms of the total amount of trade, So not just containers, but also including minerals and everything else that's moved around. Then it's about flat year on year, which is close to a record high. So whichever way you look at it, trade has recovered far more rapidly than GDP. So small open economies benefit from this, and that happens to be South Africa. We were benefiting from China doing very well. We're not the only ones. Brazil is benefiting from it too. And the issues in SA aren't our linkages to the global economy, which is actually very beneficial at this point. It's the more SA Inc. type stuff that's holding us back. Very low levels of consumer confidence, very low levels of business confidence, and again, the electricity and the debt issues. What happens now if the vaccine is rolled out? Aside from the growth forecast that we've spoken about, what else do we need to be concerned about? Well, this is a fairly concerning chart. It shows money supply growth for the US, Europe, and Japan. Money supply growth in the US at this point is 24% up year on year. And that's come about because of the Fed, in effect, monetizing government debt. So the US government goes in, provides stimulus to its population, they go and issue debt, and it's not the market that's buying the debt, it's the Fed. And the Fed is just basically printing money. And the amount of money that they use to buy that debt shows that the total money supply is up 24% year on year. It's massive. We've never seen a number like this for the US before. We haven't seen it for a number of other countries. Very briefly, we've seen it for China before. And conventionally, up until the global financial crisis, the view was if you increase money supply like this, you will land up with inflation. Now, there are two schools of thought at the moment. The one is we didn't see inflation during the global financial crisis, so we shouldn't see it now. The other is saying, well, we didn't have this growth in money supply back in the global financial crisis, and we didn't have the supply chain issues. So it's quite possible that we're going to get inflation. We're leading towards the camp that we're going to get inflation. And it's not priced in. It's not priced in at all in the market. The chart on the left shows the amount of negative yielding debt globally. So countries like Germany can borrow for negative yields. South Africa clearly can't. But there are a vast number of countries that can do. There's about $18 trillion worth of negative yielding debt globally. So you lend money to the government and you're guaranteeing that if you hold to maturity, you'll get back less than you put in. And the only reason people are willing to do that is if they expect inflation is going to be very low or negative, deflation. So the market's not concerned about. There's a huge amount. 20% of all debt that's listed globally is negative yielding. But there are reasons for concern. If you look on the chart on the right, that's year-on-year growth for the Dow Jones Grains Index. It's maize, soya, and wheat. It's up 24% year-on-year. It's the fastest growth that we've seen since 2012. And what we're going to see over the coming months is food producers attempting to push those costs on to consumers. We're already seeing it in South Africa where food price inflation is about 5.5% year-on-year. So food producers will have a choice. Either they take it in the margin and absorb it themselves, or they push prices on. And no doubt they'll do a bit of both. And we should expect global food price inflation to start to pick up now, already now. And so there are some signs of inflation picking up. It costs more to ship goods between the US and China than it's ever done before, despite the fact that the oil price has gone down and the diesel price has gone down. So there are signs globally that inflation is starting to pick up. Global inflation at this point is still very low. The median across countries is less than 1%, but we think there is reason to expect over the coming months, call it 6 to 8 months, that number is going to pick up very materially. Okay, that's our major theme. In the last 5 minutes, I want to focus on what's happening in South Africa, and then we'll be able to address any questions in the panel discussion a bit later. So first of all, we get a lot of questions on the Rand. And there are a number of ways to value the currency. The way that we prefer to do it is we have a look at the Rand relative to all of our trading partners. We weight the exchange rate by the amount of trade we do with each one. And then we strip out inflation differences. Because if inflation in South Africa is higher than other countries, you would expect the Rand to depreciate by those inflation differences. So strip that out. And then you land up with this chart. It's what's called the real effective exchange rate. And when the blue line is very low, that's periods of extreme Rand weakness. And when it's very high, that's periods of extreme Rand strength. And where we are at the moment is roughly at fair value. And we have to consider, is fair value appropriate given just inflation differences when we look at South Africa? And on the negative side in South Africa, we've got slower growth. We've got the fiscal difficulties. But on the plus side, we've got China just producing as much as they can, sucking in commodities, and the price of stuff that we export is much higher than the price of stuff that we import. Our terms of trade are the best that they've ever been before. And so we need to balance those two out. So we've done some work. It turns out about 70% of the variability of the rand is due to external factors, things that have got absolutely nothing to do with South Africa, like we saw in 2004, like we saw in the global financial crisis. And if that's the case, then we need to weight our expectation with what's happening globally. And globally, we're seeing a COVID vaccine being rolled out, China pumping up demand. We're seeing the US economy recover by next year. It would typically be a risk-on environment, in which case we expect that the rand will strengthen beyond what is fair value, just as it did in 2004 and in 2010. So for our perspective, the base case is for further currency strength relative to now, even though it's currently at fair value, because that's a risk-on trade. Now, bear in mind, that is our view. There are a number of views out there, and if you ask two economists where the rand's going to go, you'll get three different views. So just bear that in mind. But that is our base case that we're operating under. In terms of interest rates, what's likely to happen in South Africa? Well, the chart on the left is various types of food prices in SA. This is white maize, yellow maize, and soybeans. White maize and yellow maize in South Africa are up over 20% year on year. Soy prices are up 40% year on year. Food is about 15% of our basket. So we can expect some sort of food price inflation that's sustained to come through. In addition, there are going to be some base effects coming through shortly. At the moment, oil is trading about $45. A year ago, it was at 60. So it comes through as fairly significantly negative year on year. But come April next year, then the base is different. And at that point, you're comparing the base as $45 for oil, and hopefully oil is 45 at that point as well. So you go from massive deflation in oil to being flat year on year. And that causes our inflation numbers to pick up. So in April, May next year, we should expect inflation in South Africa to pick up to around about 5%. The SARB thinks it'll be 4.5%. Consensus thinks it'll be 4.5%. We think it'll be a bit higher. So just like we think there's higher inflation globally down the line, in South Africa, we think there's higher inflation too, but it's only going to be an issue in April, May next year. Up until then, inflation is still going to remain pretty low at about 3%. And what that means is that the SARB has got space for maybe one more cut, maybe. That's not even certain. But beyond that, they can't do anything. And given that inflation remains within the band by our forecast, we think rates stay pretty much where they are for the next 12 months or so. In terms of what the government pays for debt, the chart on the left is the difference between our 10-year bond yield and pretty much every other grouping of countries, the US, developed markets, emerging markets, commodity countries. Our spread is extraordinarily high. We pay a lot for debt. The government pays a lot. And part of the reason our spread is so high is the chart on the right. The government is expecting to issue about 1.3 trillion rands worth of debt over the next 3 years. And there's concerns as to who's going to buy that. We know that locals won't be able to buy all of it. So we are somewhat contingent on foreigners coming in and buying, somewhat dependent on foreigners coming in and buying our debt, which means that the budgets that come out have to be structured in such a way that it entices foreigners to come in, and that has to provide confidence to them, and hence the discussion early on about wage bills and the like. We've got a lot of debt to issue, and we need people to come in and buy it. And because we've got so much debt to issue, it's expected that our yields on our government debt are likely to remain fairly elevated over the coming year. So short yields, so the Reserve Bank yield, we don't expect to change by much. The cost of debt for the government, which is currently about 9%, we don't expect to change by much either. Are we priced for junk, or where we are? We're not just priced for junk, we're priced for worse than junk. The x-axis here is the cost of insuring your dollar-denominated debt against default. For South Africa, it's about 2.2%, so 220 basis points. So if you buy South African dollar-denominated debt, you would have to pay 2.2% per annum to cover insurance against the default by the South African government. The worse your rating is, the more you have to pay for insurance. And we can get a nice little relationship between all the countries that have got ratings for all three rating agencies and have a CDS spread. And we pretty much dead bang in line. So the downgrade was no surprise to the market. They had priced it in already. They're not pricing in any more downgrades though. And that's fairly critical. The budget that's presented at February has to be done in such a way that we satisfy Moody's, which has a negative outlook already. So we can see how the debate is being framed. We are reliant on foreign capital. We need to structure our views and our allocations of capital in such a way that it satisfies their requirements. Alternatively, we will be downgraded further. Foreigners won't buy debt. Our yields will blow out. And then we've got that debt spiral issue. So there is a way out of it, but it does involve towing line of what in effect would be our funders. Just lastly, and I recognize I have gone a couple of minutes over time here. The picture I've just described now is one where South Africa is on a tightrope in effect, and there's very little space for making any mistakes. One must recognize at the same time that there is the potential that the South African economy is doing far better than is widely expected at this point. And we can see that in a couple of ways. We can look at that tracking data, which tells us that the South African economy is probably down about 9% year on year. Consensus is saying it's down 10. But we can also look at the data that's come out of Stats SA for mining, manufacturing, retail sales, electricity production. And we can put all that together and we can try to estimate what GDP is based on that model. And that tells us, according to that model, the South African GDP is down about 5% year on year. Now we'll get the number on the 8th of December, so we don't have to wait long. It'll be a week. But there is a material probability that the South African economy is down 5% year on year instead of down 10, which is what's widely expected. And if that's the case, then the debt to GDP numbers are a bit better than everybody thinks they're going to be. And there's a bit of relief for what is the crushing burden, which is our debt. And the way to get out of the debt issue is for faster growth or for higher inflation. And it is still possible, if not likely, that over the coming year, we will have higher inflation. And it's possible that growth surprises on the upside too. So we start to resolve that debt to GDP problem through faster nominal GDP rather than attacking the debt issue. And that's a broad summary. I think we've covered most of our key points. I'm very happy to leave it there. And Bridget, if there are any questions, perhaps we should deal with them later. I know that we're running a bit behind schedule.
Thank you very much, Chris, for the insight and very rich information. Very scary, but also it gives us hope. You know, there are opportunities as well that we can capitalize on them. So we position ourselves appropriately. And I love what you just did. You know, you just shared with us the trends, what is happening globally, because it's very much important. We are part of the globe. We need to know what is happening so we can prepare ourselves accordingly and learn from what is happening in the trend. And as well as the insight looking into South Africa as well, and looking into the markets. I'm not so sure, but I've seen some few comments that have been highlighted. We will take into consideration when we go into the panel part. We won't be taking any question, unfortunately, due to time, but thank you so much for that rich information that you just shared with us. We will change a little bit slightly into our next speaker. Instead of Professor Peter Goss, we'll move to Lorraine Smith, who will be doing the presentation, who is the owner of Simply Ethics. It's also an associate member of the Ethics Institute. Lorraine's study of ethics began when she worked as a journalist. As you know, the journalists, they go out, source information, and keep everyone informed of what is happening that we do not see. She was working as a journalist initially at Carsten Community Newspaper and later at the Sunday Times. Of course, like any other job, there are challenges that they faced by the social injustices and apartheid responses. She responded by studying law instead and obtaining her LLB at the University of South Africa, and that has been her journey. While finishing her degree, Lorraine became the group ethics officer for an international blue chip organization, where her true education of organizational ethics occurred. She has 22 years working experience, 12 years of this formerly in the field of ethics. So she is very full of knowledge, very rich of knowledge. when it coming to issues of ethics. And I believe that looking at the current state of South Africa, that's what we need more than anything, to awaken those conscious that seems to be dying a little bit. We need that ethics more than anything in today's state. The institutionalization of ethics in her passion, especially training and creating solutions to assist the stakeholders, embracing ethics as well as everything to do with the whistleblowing and ethics investigation. As I've mentioned earlier, she was a journalist, and I believe she's still a journalist, because once you are a journalist, always a journalist. She does, however, have experience in the AZ of the ethics management. In that short, let me welcome Lorraine Smith to share with us her presentation. Thank you so much.
Good morning, Bridget. It's great to join IRMSA again and to speak on ethics. I'm sure you're aware it's my passion, and I'm always happy to share what I suppose I could call the gospel of ethics. So yes, it's great to be back with you once again. And yeah, the Eastern Cape seems to be where I am at the moment. I've been doing quite a bit of work in the Eastern Cape lately, so it's great to be joining everyone there as well. So I'm going to just go straight into it, since we're quite short on time this morning. And as I like to do whenever I'm speaking to a group of people, I just want to talk about what we're referring to when we speak about ethics. All right, just to make sure that we're all on the same page. So when we're speaking about ethics, we have personal ethics and we have organizational ethics. Personal ethics is about what is good for the self and for others. And I think there's been no time where it's been more clear than now during the COVID pandemic. It's been a real case of having to look at balancing our own interests versus the interests of the greater society. Now, moving that into organizational ethics, there we're talking about the ethical standards and principles or ethical values and principles that are applied when the organization interacts with its stakeholders. We can take that to government, we can take it into any group, and it's how that group interacts with its stakeholders. Now, I think we just need to reflect on why ethics is so important at a time such as this and what we're going through at the moment. The previous speakers have spoken on the challenges that have been faced, and I think we can all agree they have been many. Everyone has felt the impact, and certainly even if we look at the 2008 global recession, no event in any of our living memories, I don't think, has ever hit the world with such intensity and on such a scale. So it really provides a good reference point. So I think just to take a quick moment to reflect on what the benefits of an ethical society are, but bringing it into organizations too, because obviously you start from small, an ethical individual, then your ethical organization, an ethical country, and an ethical world. Wouldn't that be great? All right. So when you've got a group that is ethical, what essentially you've achieved is you've provided certainty. All right, so you've provided certainty on what behaviors are expected. But not only that, you've also provided certainty on what behaviors can be expected from the organization. So in, for example, an institution or an organization, employees know what they can expect from management. So they will trust that the organization will make decisions that are in the best interests of their stakeholders and the organization. And if this is something that's been institutionalized, they would have the confidence to know without a huge amount of stress and uncertainty. All right. So what this means is when you hit a situation that is essentially a crisis, so such as the beginning of the COVID outbreak, they're more likely to trust the decisions that are made. The trauma impact is lessened. Okay, they're also more likely to follow the rules that are put in place. You'll have less resistance. Now, this could be seen in South Africa. The initial stage is decisive action, society complied. All right. However, that trust is required as you go forward. All right. So, coupled with the trust that's being created, an ethical organization also needs to have inherent, strong, established ethical decision-making skills. All right. Not only at a management level, but throughout the organization. So when there's a situation in play where there isn't specific rules to deal with the situation, they have got values and standards that can guide their decisions. For example, they're presented with a situation, and instead of making knee-jerk decisions, they can be guided by the principles that are in place. Similarly, when you get into some very serious and not typical ethical dilemmas, there are quite strong ethical decision-making models which are designed to equip decision makers with broadening their perspectives to prevent them from making decisions with what we call an ethical blind spot. Right, so it ensures that they don't make decisions from the normal, again, a knee-jerk point of view, which tends to happen quite badly when you are in a crisis situation. Okay, so here's the problem, we do this and we fix the problem. In ethical decision-making, you would take into consideration human rights, legalities. You would take, I'm just gone blank on all of this. There's several of them. Utilitarianism, the principles involved, etc., etc. Now that's important when you're moving from a crisis situation to moving it along from it being an initial crisis to now managing what we're all referring to as the new normal. All right, so we're not quite out of this pandemic situation, but we are needing to move forward without focusing on all the impacts of what has occurred and the challenges that are being faced. How do we start operating again and recovering and moving forward while still taking into account the situations and the challenges that we are facing in society right now, in the business world, etc. All right. So an organization or a group that has an established ethical culture will already have in their DNA the ability to make decisions that are well considered, that have more sustainability in them, and that will be more trusted, because they are less likely to have blind spots. All right. This, as I've mentioned, is what will strengthen and maintain the trust and allow the organization to move forward, balancing all the interests of the stakeholders. Okay. It also allows you to make decisions that are more justifiable, and will also encourage compliance. All right. I think we saw very clearly where in South Africa we first had excellent compliance from society, and we sort of need to examine what was it that created people's reluctance to start complying. You know, without going into a lot of debate here, is what created people's lack of motivation to continue complying. You know, I look around me now. I come from a very small area here in Gauteng, and you know, the compliance to wearing masks, even using sanitizer when you go into shops, etc., is not being adhered to, and there's a lot of justification. You know, people are justifying their actions, but I think that will to cooperate has diminished quite radically. All right. So let's take a look at the current state of ethics and the COVID challenges, and just to see where we're at when it comes to this. You know, they say that ethics floats, the law floats on a sea of ethics. I prefer to say that ethics floats, ethics forms the foundation of everything. All right. So having worked in that huge global organization, which had many challenges, it had legal challenges, it had safety challenges, compliance challenges, all sorts of things like that. And I always argue that if you're in a proactive organization and you get your ethics right, the rest of the things fall into place, because you've then worked on the values within the organization. You've worked on people's motivations, you've worked on their hearts and souls, and people have a better understanding of why they do things. All right, so once you get that right, and it's not easy, but if you get that right, all the other things that need to be done happen a lot more effectively and with a lot less resistance. So, okay, that being said, I think many functions believe that of their roles. You know, risk management, if we all just work with a risk mindset and compliance, we work with a compliance mindset. But I really do believe that if you get the ethics correct and the values of the organization really well entrenched in the organization, it does solve a lot of the other factors that need to be considered. Right. So looking at where we are now, the state of ethics and ethics management in South Africa, the Ethics Institute recently did a survey with ethics practitioners throughout South Africa, well, in Southern Africa, to just see what's happening in the profession at the moment. And it was quite interesting to see where we are, especially as somebody who's been working, I think we're now at 13 or 14 years in the profession. And it's quite disheartening to see that there hasn't been too much change from an organizational perspective, from a management point of view. So what came out of this was that 71% of ethics officers or ethics practitioners are still doing ethics as a role of another job. All right, so basically 3/4 of ethics officers have this as they are a risk manager doing ethics or a compliance officer doing ethics. So they're doing it on a part-time basis. Now, if any of you do deal and will have this as part of your responsibility, you'll appreciate the complexities of what ethics, creating an ethical culture and ethics management actually entails. It's a huge amount of work if it's going to be done properly. If it's going to be a tick box exercise, you're not going to achieve the objectives and reap the benefits of what ethics can really do for your organization. So yes, we've still got 3/4 of people still doing it as a part-time role. More scary than that is that 68% of people don't have it included as part of their KPIs. All right, so it's a part-time role, but it's a charity case. You know, you've got to do it, but you're going to get measured on the rest of your role. Okay, so there's no incentive to actually do it. I think from the people I've interacted with, which is many people over the years, most people do it out of a love of it and see it, they're committed to it and they have a passion for it. But, you know, at the end of the day, everyone has to eat and it becomes quite demotivating, right? It's also still being placed in areas that are quite a challenge. All right, so for example, it's still being placed in human resources, which is difficult because human resources is an area where employees don't trust. They have the inevitable, the enviable situation where they have to be management's mouthpiece and say one thing when in reality something else happens, so they're not trusted. They're also seen as the part of the organization that still, you know, has to do the disciplining. So people might be less likely to go and confide and obtain advice, being scared that they will there'll be repercussions for any advice that they go and obtain. Another popular area for ethics to be placed is risk. It's in fact it's the second most popular place for ethics to be placed. That's my experience as well. I do the assessment of people who are being trying to be certified as ethics officers, and very often it's risk managers or people working in the risk function. And while there are overlaps, it is different, and it can cause some disparity, all right? Because if you look at it, risk's role is to categorize. I just want to, your focus is on categorizing risk, okay, and developing mitigations. Okay, so that is part of ethics management, but it is so much more than that. And that filter can actually disrupt some of the ethics management requirements. So in fact, there's a strong integration, but it's also, again, once again, not ideal, although there should be a strong collaboration. Okay, again, also compliance and company secretary are popular places for it to be placed. All right. Okay, what are the challenges that ethics practitioners are facing? All right, a lack of resources. I think everyone has a lack of resources, but it's getting worse. COVID, of course, companies are struggling, but year on year, I think ethics is getting cut quite drastically. And there again, that provides the inability to do proper training so that these skills of making good decisions and modeling the correct behaviors becomes quite challenging. I know recently I was doing a focus group with some employees where it became apparent quite quickly that we hadn't even moved on to ethics yet. They didn't even understand the values of the organization and not even, you know, aligned with what that organization meant the values were, but what values are and what that means to the organization. So there can be quite strong challenges when it doesn't have the correct amount of focus. All right. 13% of practitioners said that corruption, illegality, and no organizational will was preventing them from executing what they needed to execute. Now, this is something that we face, unfortunately, quite a bit, is ethics is done for compliance. We say what we need to say and we do what we need to do so that we can fill in our annual reports and our integrated reports and do the things that we need to do. But in reality, it's an afterthought. And this to me is a pity because there really is such benefit to doing it, but it is tough and it requires commitment. And I think, as I've mentioned, during times of crisis, it can really reap such major rewards. But yes, I often say to people, a lot of organizations can become 100% more ethical by just saying, we don't want to do ethics, we really just want to do compliance. And then at least we are dealing with an honest organization. Right. Then another challenge is that there are misconceptions and fear about what the ethics practitioner does. I think there's a history of ethics being related to hotlines and whistleblowing, and people still see them as policemen, or they just see them as the people who deal with, personal interest disclosures, etc. All right. Also, you're getting the buy-in from senior management, getting access to senior management, poor awareness. Okay, that's part of the task of an ethics practitioner, but getting that message across to decision makers. Then there's a lot of ethics practitioners who say they actually don't have the correct skills to do it. They need better training. They say a lack of an ethical culture, and that is a challenging one. That requires a huge amount of intervention, huge amount of commitment from the organization. All right, or they've done their work, they've made their recommendations, and nothing has come of it. All right, that can also be a huge one. And this is where your audit committees and your social and ethics committees become so key in driving this agenda. All right, ethics is treated as a tick box exercise. There's a poor tone at the top, or there's a resistance to any change in the organization. So really, my message along all the line, these statements is, from my experience, very little has unfortunately changed. I think we've got more sophisticated in how we report on it, but we still have a long way to go when it comes to managing ethics and reaping the benefits of it. So yes, I think if we have that in place, we could deal with these things a lot better. Unfortunately, putting it in insurance terms, ethics still seems to be a grudge purchase. And if we're talking about the impact of COVID, the new normal, and how organizations will implement things going forward, I think it will be of great benefit to start placing some focus on culture going forward. Society is changing, how we do work is changing, and Gillian mentioned earlier on, in the opening this morning, things like training, potentially you losing the human touch. I think for me personally, that's been one of the most difficult things, is doing ethical interventions without that face-to-face interaction. And I personally am having to adapt to that. A lot of what I do requires reading people and getting information from them, or appealing to their personalities and themselves. And it's become quite challenging, and I'm also trying to find ways to get around that. We're talking to people's psyches, and it's going to require a lot, but I think it's needed. I do believe that there are people who are feeling isolated in this new way of working from home, working through cameras and screens. Right now, I am speaking to a screen, whether there's a presentation up or it's my own face I'm looking at, which I don't particularly enjoy. I am used to reading people's faces. That's what I've always done, you know, as an interviewer, as a trainer. That's what I do. I'm used to the interaction from people, reading comments in a comments box, which I've had to learn to not look at till the end of my, you know, what I'm saying, is extremely challenging. So there's a lot of that to overcome, and I think ethics is one of the ways we will be able to facilitate that psychological and emotional change for people. I think until we focus on our values, on the ethical values and standards that we apply when an organization interacts with its stakeholders, we're not going to be properly equipped to deal with these changes from an organizational perspective. I don't think that we will be properly equipped to deal with the traumas, the morale issues, and all of those, you know, all of those factors, the internal factors, even maybe with external stakeholders. And of course, the knock-on from that becomes a lot of your risks, organizational risks, because it's been proven employees who don't feel they're being treated fairly or are demoralized, etc., especially in tough economic times, in uncertain times, is where you start finding people who will start committing economic crime, and other factors like that. So it can cause even more disruption to your organization. And I think it also becomes very clear, I know in the program today, you're going to have all these, you've got other digital risks. Digital is the one somebody's just mentioned here. You've got a whole lot of new internal controls that have to be introduced, and oversight and all that. And if you've got all these controls that have to be put in place, but if you've got the values and the ethical culture correct already, those risks have already been minimized while you put in the auditable, measurable controls. I think that's really covering what it is that I wanted to say, and I've hit my 25 minutes. Bridget, I don't know if you want to go through any of the questions, if we have time for questions.
Thank you, Lorraine. We will deal with the questions later when we are discussing through the panel discussion. We are afraid to run the risk of time lapsing before we deal with the entire presentation, but we will attend to the comments and the questions that have been posed through the chat box. So we won't be taking questions now, thanks.
Okay.
Thank you so much, Lorraine, for the information that you've shared. We really appreciate that. And my take is, I believe that more than anything, we need a culture change. We need a mindset change. We need change management now more than ever to change the culture of compliance, to usher us into the world of Canaan, of doing things based on the benefits that we get when we're practicing it. To do things the right way the first time, to do things right even when no one is looking, to have that ethical standards and doing things right when no one is watching. It doesn't matter how much control we put in place, frameworks we have, compliance circular that we issue, the bailout money that might be coming, as long as the attitude and the culture is still the same, I am afraid that we won't see any different result. So thank you so much. We will be moving to our third presenter, who is Professor Peter Goss. And I like how he calls himself 3-decade professional veteran, meaning we're going to hear so much wealth of knowledge here. Peter Goss heads his subject matter expert consultancy, which is called Peter Goss Pty Ltd, specializing in corporate governance and forensic auditing. The practice also provides training, it facilitates and inside professional mentoring service. Peter serves as a professional professor of practice, governance, and forensic auditing at the University of Johannesburg. In addition, he's also an author of 3 books covering subject matter titled Corporate Governance and Illicit Conduct. He's also a regular and a current affair corporate governance and anti-corruption commentator for news broadcast media such as ENCA, Newsroom Africa, Radio 702, and Kaya FM. Ladies and gentlemen, let's welcome Professor Peter Goss.
Thank you. And thank you, colleagues, for having us. I'm going to try and share some slides with you now. Program Director, I trust you can see these slides.
Yes, I can see the slides, thanks.
Thank you. And I trust then that the colleagues attending can also see them. Thank you. This is a presentation that comes from some work I did for a major international insurance company that asked me the question on what is it we should keep in mind from COVID that we can use as lessons learned for the purposes of transposing COVID lessons onto mitigating fraud and corruption risk in the context of risk governance. So we'll be considering fraud and corruption in a post-COVID environment. And first of all, the introduction to it is the following. One, we'll focus on fraud viewed in parallel with COVID-19. For the purpose of this discussion, fraud and corruption is what we often call corporate fraud, fraud in the business environment, often also called financial crime, economic crime, or white-collar crime. So let's look firstly at the problem of fraud. Globally, it is indeed a problem, and certainly not any less in South Africa. So the worldwide numbers for the performance, let's call it, of fraud and corruption start with relatively low numbers like South African currency, 670 million rands per annum, based on a survey of cases by a large firm, a Big 5 firm, and up to 16 trillion rand in the impact on the global economy. Now, as a corruption problem, we see it differently in South Africa. We see that the cost of corruption, particularly around state capture, for example, has been estimated as 1.5 trillion rand to the SA economy, based on cases such as state capture by government officials, by politicians, by private companies, and by business leaders. So the corruption problem is certainly not restricted to a particular industry, and certainly a problem across industries and across different types of role players in the economy. As a corporate governance crisis too, as a risk governance crisis, we should also look at corruption in terms of its major corporate collapse manifestations. More recently, we've noticed the case of Steinhoff since 2017, now all over the media, the case of VBS Bank in the Limpopo province, the case of Tongaat Hulets, for example, and of course, as an industry and multi-sectoral problem, you see it in cartels, price-fixing cartels, in financial services, A major international bank, Citibank, was fined 70 million for price fixing related irregularities, or for collusive competitive practices. Retail companies have been found responsible for price fixing. Human capital consulting companies have been found responsible for price fixing in public tenders. So fertile conditions for grand fraud are clearly evident across the globe. These conditions are the following. One, first and foremost, what is troubling is that democracy now has a price. You can buy democracy for a price in many parts of the world. You'll find that political leaders have business interests or business partnerships and are funded by business sector. So business can position itself. In the US, the converse of state capture is what is called deep capture. Deep capture is where businesses can proactively position for which politician they want in office and fund the lobby of that politician. Even fund a lobby to drive new laws proactively, influencing those politicians that they placed in office through funding of their electoral efforts. So the glaring problem we have around the world right now is that democracy is available for a price. You all know right now we have a dilemma in our own country where there are question marks about the funding of a particular senior office bearer who is alleged to have secured funds from various individuals and entities in support of that individual's political party campaign. Very troubling. So movement is now gone away from social democracy, which is traditionally government for the people, by the people, to what we call a democracy that is based on a capitalist democratic model. Government by a political elite, government by the connected. Those who can raise the most funding are going to become our leaders, are going to become our presidents, are going to become our members of the executive committees and parliamentarians. Not different in the private sector. Those with the majority of equity and shares in a company, they control the vote. They control the board of directors. Therefore, they control the board of directors nominations and can manipulate shareholder votes and shareholder democracy processes. Government ministers can appoint the directors of state-owned companies at a whim, never mind experience. Government ministers can appoint directors as they wish, and you find people in those positions don't have qualifications. They reward them as rewards for patronage. Patronage is where you develop a long-term relationship with an individual, and at some point in time, you expect the one party expects the other party to quote-unquote pay back for that patronage. What's most troubling on this slide is that even assurance providers like auditors are now toothless, are regularly seen to be toothless, sometimes even implicated in fraud and corruption. So 21st century pandemics have been moving alongside these developments. And this pandemic of COVID is certainly not the first we'll see around the world. There have been many pandemics around the world, and there are many more to come. And I think COVID is but one that we'll see for the future. We've been warned by scientists for a long time now to be wary, of the emergence of superbugs. Well, the COVID bug, certainly, COVID bacteria has certainly proven itself to be a superbug. Other superbugs we've seen in 2002, SARS in China, we've seen H1N1 in Mexico and the US in 2010. So in the 21st century, we've seen as many as 6 different pandemics of the magnitude of the COVID virus. So 21st century, alongside the viruses that we've seen affect the world and various pandemic diseases, has also shown us the following. The 21st century is also fertile for fraud. The first 2 decades of the 21st century showed us over 6 pandemics. We now see we have a number of major fraud incidents, and let's handle 2 of those pertinent to our country. Exclamation points in South Africa for 21st century fertile for fraud. 15 years after the major Enron collapse internationally, And not too long ago, just 10 years ago, 12 years ago, was the 2008 global financial collapse as a result of overgearing in property, in the mortgaging industry by the banking sector, where they geared properties, gave loans for those properties, and the properties could not match the underlying value for which the loan was given. In South Africa now we see, in 2017, the major corporate governance failure being the Steinhoff collapse, arguably the greatest corporate governance failure in corporate history in South Africa. 7.3 billion rand in overstated profits, wiping out 200 billion rand of market value. Fictitious transactions with questionable companies pretending to be independent third parties in this. We see here the auditors being implicated in the matter or being under investigation now by the independent regulatory body for auditors. And the problems in this matter, common to many of these 21st century fertile for fraud corporate failures, dominant chief executive and absence of independence of the chairperson of the board, opaque, limited disclosure of financial transactions, not only limited, but manipulated disclosure of financial transactions, as in this case we saw that it was overstatement of profits. We see it in another organization in South Africa, Tonga, Units, overstated financial results. VBS Bank looting of some 2 billion rands. The KPMG spy probe, an audit firm implicated in major issues. And that firm hasn't been removed from being implicated in the VBS Bank scandals. And of course, the auditors of the organization, the Gupta-linked empire. Of course, we all know the most pronounced one, 2016-2017, in South Africa, emerging after the 2016 report of the Public Protector, was the State of Capture report issued by the Public Protector. Corrupt award of government contracts to private individuals, to companies that are private, to professional services firms, to politically exposed parties and political elites. We saw related transactions. We saw conflicts of interest. We saw involvement of very senior politicians and ministers and the like. We saw the laundering of political patronage, which I highlighted to you earlier on in the ability to purchase democracy. We saw this Gupta family empire having benefited from relationships with our president of the time. And we saw much of what we call grand corruption and the irregular award of tenders. Public bureaucrats accepting gifts and other undue benefits in exchange for doing their work that should be done in the public good. So parallel solutions we can draw from COVID, fraud risk governance solutions. Let's look at COVID solutions. COVID solutions are, we noticed, awareness was first and foremost in the COVID crisis. Educate people about the problem so that they can do better about the problem. Secondly, we found predicting as being very pronounced in the COVID crisis. In other words, statistical analysis looking for trends around COVID, emerging trends all the time. We see it every night. Then we enter the arena of protection, which is deterrent measures. Deterrent being, for example, wearing a mask in the case of COVID. Then prevention measures, which is keeping a social distance, for example. Isolating yourself when you find that you have a risk of being infected. We call that containment. And then, of course, you prosecute the COVID. You prosecute it by taking the appropriate vitamins, by treating yourself, vitamin C, D, B, and various other proactive means of building your immune system, developing antibodies and enhancing your immunity as part of the recuperation process. So we can draw parallels between COVID and the fraud risk governance process. Awareness, prediction, deterrence, prevention, containment, prosecution, and recuperation. So corporate fraud being anemic, being transforming, and seeing that we now have even a 2020 global financial crisis, because COVID has caused a 2020 global financial crisis, we can look for solutions from COVID that we can match to fraud risk governance. For example, prediction. We can draw solutions for fraud risk governance by predicting, by analyzing statistics of fraud, drawing lessons from the past, and that will reduce the opportunity for fraud. We can prevent fraud through due diligence processes, anti-fraud controls, vetting, background screening, being skeptical about transactions, and scrutinizing transactions before they are approved. In other words, identifying greed. So prevention includes proactively identifying signs of greed. Detection, putting in whistleblowing and proactive internal auditing mechanisms at the center of cracking major cases of fraud. Understanding the motive is what you do through a detection system. So whistleblowing helps you understand the motive of your fraudster. Early tracking, critical for fraud. In other words, preventing fraud proactively by understanding the trends of past fraud. And tracing, as with COVID, tracing other infected people, so too with fraud, tracing of fraudulent offenders, once you understand their motive, proactively tracing them. Containment. When you find the fraud and when you find the suspect, you reduce the opportunity by early suspension of the individual, by early suspension or blacklisting or cancellation of contract with service providers to reduce greed, to reduce the prospect that the service provider will keep being paid for services not rendered. You cancel that contract, you suspend that contract, you suspend the project manager, and you initiate punitive actions as part of your containment measures. So recuperation in the context of fraud is the reducing of future opportunity. So in reducing fraud, as with COVID, you take more vitamins, you improve your immune system. In fraud, you should improve your controls. You should revise your systems and controls. You should deploy high-risk individuals by making sure that you distribute their representation in high-risk positions. You make sure that you segregate the responsibilities of high-risk individuals. And you communicate lessons learned to those who can look for those lessons learned and help us prevent the risk of future fraud. So as you can see, we can draw from COVID many lessons to combat fraud and to manage fraud risk governance more comprehensively. As I get to a close, I want to share with you a slide from a recent doctoral dissertation I finalized. And I've developed in that doctoral dissertation, a 250-page dissertation, a model, an integrated model. And that integrated model for addressing corporate governance and corporate corruption, subtitled A Comprehensive Risk Governance Solution, entails making sure that we leverage historical systemic interventions to manage corporate governance and corporate corruption. What are those? Preventative means, controls, governance structures, boards of directors, focus teams to mitigate fraud risk, and anti-fraud and anti-corruption controls as systemic interventions. Then there are collective action interventions, getting employees to join us in the fight against fraud, getting service providers to join us in the fight against fraud, getting our customers to join us in the fight against fraud, getting the general public to join us in the fight against corruption. So what this model comes from is the misdiagnosis of fraud and corruption. Fraud and corruption has been misdiagnosed as merely involving a person with authority, manipulating their authority. What we miss is that fraud and corruption, high up on the cause of fraud and corruption, is patronage. The only way to undo patronage is to take collective action against those patrons playing games with each other, is to take collective action by voting right, by exercising democracy, by making sure our voice is heard. So collective action is the new angle to this integrated model, is not to lean on traditional systemic interventions alone, but to use collective action to fight those who are corrupt. So corporate governance solutions sit on the back of these two dimensions. Corporate governance solutions, or corporate corruption solutions, sit on systemic interventions and collective action interventions in this model that I've put together after much study over the last 4 years. And it should sit on also, in turn, that entire model must sit on a corporate governance regime. A corporate governance regime founded on not only shareholder theory, not only the theory of giving an agent power to run the company, but on collective action theory. Theory incorporating the roles of multiple stakeholders to fight fraud and corruption. As I said, service providers, business partners, employees, the general public, management, the board of directors, independent directors, the politicians should all be part of this collective action theory solution. So even those who are part of the problem should be dragged kicking and screaming to the corporate governance integrated model for addressing corporate governance and corporate corruption. And we should encourage stewardship theory and stakeholder theory. Stewardship theory is where those given power must serve as stewards over the assets we have entrusted to them. They must not look for opportunities in their assets for personal benefit, but rather look for opportunities in the assets for public benefit, for customer benefit, for broader stakeholder benefit. So this integrated model for addressing corporate governance and corporate corruption is somewhat innovative post the COVID arena and post various lessons we've learned around the world for how one can mitigate corruption, and particularly corporate corruption, using a comprehensive risk governance solution. There's a lot behind this particular slide in a 250-page paper that we will share once it has been published. So, colleagues, COVID has alerted us to new innovative fraud risk governance solutions by drawing from COVID and drawing from the innovations of the fraudsters during COVID. Fraud and corruption, as with pandemics, are here to stay. Ours is to stay safe, to put a pun on words, to be robust with those who expose us, to contain their greed, their motives and opportunities through collective action, to keep steps ahead, because the more of us that are involved in collective action, the more we will share with each other who's the fraudster, who's the emerging fraudster. And we'll learn from the painful lessons of the past that these fraudsters leave behind. The good part of some of these fraudsters is they leave us with scabs and wounds, and those wounds, we must learn from those wounds as we go forward. I thank you for your time, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Professor, for the mouthful presentation. So full of passion. I could see the passion in your presentation, and we do appreciate even the framework that you've just shared with us on how to deal with corporate fraud and corruption. You know, it's amazing how many systems we have put in place to prevent and to detect fraud, and yet for some reason people still feel to do it. And my question is, how did we get there? How did we get where we are now? And how do we come out of this pandemic of fraud and corruption? I would call that, because it's like a disease. It's like cancer. It's spreading throughout the entire body. And I believe that we can do it if we have a zero tolerance to fraud and corruption. It is going to be difficult, of course, because there are tendencies already that became a habit and define who we are as a country. But it is possible if we have zero tolerance to fraud and corruption. And I'm thankful for people like you who are committed and dedicating their time to go deeper into research and give us this kind of dissertation and frameworks. Thank you so much, Professor, for that. We are now moving to our last speaker for the day before we go to the panel discussion. We are going to welcome Mr. Sifiso Skenjana. He is the Chief Economist and a Thought Leadership Executive at IQ Business and a former founder and financial economist at Afra Consultant, a research and economist advisory company with advisory experience across various sectors and sub-industries. He has 11 years industrial experience. Mr. Sifiso, we are welcoming you. The stage is yours.
It's a good morning to everyone, and it's an absolute pleasure to join you and have I think there's very important conversations around the industry and sector and understanding, I guess, also the winds of change that are contextualized by the risk function in an organizational context as well as a governmental and broader economic context. I think for me, what we thought would be an interesting conversation to have today is understanding the risk and sustainability function in a digitally intensifying marketplace, and what are the things that are currently taking place, but also some of the things that I think should inspire us to approach our work and think very differently about that particular function. I think, one of the conversations we've been having recently around particularly, let's say, the role of the forensic function in an organization, it's tended to be very reactive in nature, is that it waits for an event to take place and then it follows some remedial process. And while you may have systems and processes in place to try to prevent it, but largely it's tended to be quite reactive. And so the question and the thinking about it is how do we take a view of organizational resilience as the forensic function? So it's actually more about building resilience in the organization and not so much about, for example, it being a punitive approach to finding the wrongdoers in an organizational context. I think once we talk about the word resilience, I think then it becomes interesting around, well, what are the tools that inform an organization's resilience or a governmental department's resilience, etc. I think that's where, for me, one of the pieces of the conversations I wanted to start is to say, given then the digital intensification that we are seeing in the marketplace, how much are we doing to make sure that we understand the digital opportunity for the spaces that we occupy? And I think this is that, and that opportunity is in pursuit, of course, as I said, of building this organizational resilience, and I'll get to it, right? And so there are a number of sectors and industry and economic participants who started to look at how some of these opportunities mean or what they mean for their industries. And I'll make an example. In the UK now, one of the things that they're looking at is around how do the top retailers leverage AI and machine learning to reduce food wastage, right? And they do that through some form of demand forecasting, some price discovery mechanisms, inventory optimization, circumvention of some logistical challenges, etc. Right? And that's just looking at, for example, the role of AI in which it can reduce operational risk for that particular retailer, as well as, of course, then the profitability metrics. And I think that's the conversation we're going to get to, is that often for me, even when we're thinking about digitalization, we've got to look at it, I think, in three primary pillars. Is that there's an economic variable for the organization, whether it's a profitability variable, cost containment, and human capital development one. We'll get to that. And then there's a legislative one, either internally, legislative, or externally. So that's where the compliance function goes in, but other external functions, for example, how external legislation can impact how the organization operates. And then there's an investment component, but I'll unpack that. But the first point I want to emphasize again is that how much are you doing to understand the digital opportunity for the space that you're occupying, right? One of the most interesting pieces of content I've read recently is around how farmers are actually looking at they're looking at facial recognition as a mechanism of preventing stock theft, right? And so now there's an opportunity to actually do facial recognition for cows in a way in which that transfers, and even through a trade or an auction process, such that cows can't be stolen unless they fit the right digital profile or digital avatar, if I can call it that, for that particular cow farm, etc. So again, going back to the organization, to the context that it is important and critical to understand what the digital opportunity means for the space that you occupy. As I said, is that there are a number of economic variables that become a first thing that we observe as one of the things that can build resilience within an organizational context. And so for me, what's coming up quite loudly at this point in time is the difference between digital skills and skills for a digital future, right? And within the risk function, I think there's a combination of both. There are skills that are pertaining, for example, to things like artificial intelligence, machine learning, IoT, etc., as well as then saying, well, what does the call center of the future look like, for example, in the context in which it becomes an enabling function for a risk management operation in an organization. And so when we look at the first one around skills for a digital future, we're seeing that in the context of many organizations, I think in the UK, we found that, or the report at least found that about 48% of the organizations did not have cybersecurity skills, right? And these are the questions that we must be asking in our own context. It says, what kind of skills audits have we done to ensure that we do our skills mapping in line with the cyber and security and fraud management and fraud detection skills that at the pace at which those are changing in the marketplace, and given also that we are seeing, of course, the rise of e-commerce on the back of COVID. What that's done? I mean, if we look at even some of the most developed economies, where I think online retailers in Germany, about 95% of them had their customers exposed to email fraud. In Netherlands, it was about 93. In the UAE, and that includes the Arab states, was about 90%, and all the way down to the UK, which was about 60%. Right. And so if we know that we're in a space, for example, where e-commerce is almost tripled for some of the organizations that have recently reported their numbers, we then have to respond from a risk point of view to ensure, and I think it's important for us to call it risk and sustainability. I think this is where, for me, that emphasis around organizational resilience becomes more center stage when you're talking about sustainability. Is that it's around emphasizing the context around which we create sustainability for the organization. The second, the last part around this human capital development component is that often we understate, I think, or underemphasize just the role of human capital development in this particular function. Right, technological process, the technological process as defined by Paul Romer, Nobel laureate as an economist, speaks around that when we talk about long-term aggregate output growth, and that's either for an economy or for a company, is that the three primary inputs, right, there's capital stock, there's human capital, and then there's innovation. But the point he makes is that innovation is not an exogenous thing that comes into the organization or into the country. It's something that's endogenously determined. And so which means that the level of your human capital will inform also the level of your technology and innovation process. The level of your capital stock will work in tandem with the human capital level to inform the kind of innovation that you've got in an organization. What that means for the context of this conversation is that when we are looking at economic variables for an organization around, for example, profitability, making sure that we grow and we aren't as sustainable to fraud and all of these risky events, if I can call it that, within an organizational context, we've got to understand that the human is at the center of all of that. And so our investment, our biggest investment, has actually got to center the human being. And so one of the pieces of work we've been exploring now is what we call the fourth citizen. And the fourth citizen really speaks to that. What does a fourth industry ready employee look like for the context of the industry in which you operate, right? And for the context of the risk function, for example, that you need, in your organization. And I think that when we start to journey towards that kind of question around understanding what my fourth citizen looks like, and then it becomes quite easy then to understand the current skills profile, the skills gap, which is then informed by that fourth citizen, and how do we close that skills gap. And then the second function, I think, that builds onto the organizational resilience conversation is around understanding the internal legislative function as well as the external legislative functions, right? Compliance will never go away, right? And for many people outside of kind of the risk and compliance function, compliance people are really the ugly stepsister, ugly stepbrother, because they seem to be a pain on everyone's neck around just getting things done in a particular way. But this compliance function is changing over time, depending on, of course, the organization that you're in. But for example, if you're in financial services, there's massive changes happening there on a daily basis. Take, for example, how many legislative, proposals that have come from as early as 2012, for example. There's the ADR, then we've had POPI, we've had a whole lot of other things coming into this context. And so we've got to understand and say, how do we contextualize external legislative developments with our organizational planning from an internal point of view? And so often, again, organizations tend to be very responsive or reactive to what's happening externally from a legislative development point of view. And then they're often too late to catch up to the organizational planning needs, right? Even if we're talking about how standards are changing from a QA point of view, or as I said, whether it's POPI that we're looking at, all of these external legislative functions that are moving all the time have got to almost move a similar pace at how that moves at an internal point of view. And I think, dashboarding here becomes an interesting play. And this is where, again, the digital conversation comes in, is that how do we understand? And so platform becomes, is a growing, call it subsector within how digital is enabling organizations to do their planning, right? And so how do we ensure that we've got the right pieces of information at any point in time, and we can see live data that will enable us to move almost as fast as what the market requires us to move. And so how do we leverage then things like platform and dashboard design and leveraging Internet of Things, web scraping, all of that? These are smart technologies that can inform the way in which an organization's internal function from a risk and compliance point of view matches quite closely with the industry developments and industry needs for the pace in which they need to change, right? And I think that's the important lens through which we also look at this internal and external legislative function within the organization. I think the last one, and even here, I think it's lended itself to some interesting debates around, for example, what we heard from Minister Mboweni when he was talking about zero-based budgeting, and saying that we're moving, or they want to move towards a process where provincial or governmental departments, at the start of every budgeting season, in essence, have to justify their budgeting projects instead of following the use it or lose it kind of budgeting approach that they used to do. All of this stuff, for example, then how do you manage that? Right? So how do you know when a budget process is being done correctly? And so digital, again, becomes such a critical enabler in how you do your integrated reporting in an organization, how you do it if you are, for example, in pursuit of zero-based budgeting. How do you manage that? And so we're seeing more and more, again, the role of these platforms in enabling more integrated reporting or closer management of whatever function that is a particular risk exposed function within the organization. And I think these are the things that we've got to ask those questions more proactively. We've got to think about that in the way in which we do our strategy planning. Often, if you look at any organizational strategy plans, is that risk is a footnote in the context of that, primarily because of the role that it's historically played in the organization. I think we need to now move risk into an advisory function into the organization and say, actually, if you are trying to achieve this level of sales, this is the exposure from a risk point of view, and therefore this is the risk propensity that will enable or disable you from meeting your sales target as an e-commerce firm, because as soon as people don't trust the fact that they can buy safely, and therefore the drop-off rate will increase, and therefore your profitability budgets or forecasts won't meet up to the ones that you've currently put in place. And so that, I think, for me, is one of the things that from a risk point of view, really got to change the risk function into an advisory function for the organization. And I think that's when we start to look at risk as an enabler for organizational resilience, in the way in which it organizes itself, as well as in the way in which it expresses itself in the organization. And then the last one is around investment, and say, with all the things that are happening and everyone seems to run for systems, right? No, we've got to invest in systems, and we've got to invest in this one and this one. And that seems to be the broad investment conversation that enables the risk function. But I think what's happening in a lot of the other sectors that are quite interesting in the marketplace, where they are seeing different forms of disruption. Take financial services, they've seen disruptions coming in from fintechs, insurance, they've seen disruptions coming from insurtechs, manufacturing has seen disruption coming in from 3D printing. All of those disruptions are actually closing an interesting vacuum in the market. And I think for me, that's probably where we should start thinking about the risk investment as well, or the investment within the context of the risk function, and say, actually, where are the real winds of change coming in, and how are they going to impact the way an organization works, the way an organization is able to manage the risk, as well as its exposure to certain risk functions. And therefore, the planning process from an investment point of view has got to then target, I think, this vacuum that currently exists in various areas. So if you are in a food environment and there's standards and quality assurance, is that what's the vacuum that's there right now? Where's the onerous component in the QA process that then can be filled by some disruptive technology coming into that space? That's, for me, the investment conversation that's got to be driven by the risk and sustainability teams. Again, it emphasizes the point that I was making, is that we've got to be proactive in thinking about the role of risk and sustainability in building organizational resilience. And organizational resilience and sustainability will also then be anchored around the competitive landscape in which it operates. And I think that's where, again, for me as a parting shot, I just wanted to say is that it's going to be critical to embed the risk function in how we think about operationalizing, as well as the understanding the competitive landscape for an organization, primarily because the role ought to be the one that understands the fault lines in the market, the fault lines in our operating model, and make sure then that the investment is geared and targeted towards responding to those fault lines and ensuring that we remain competitively advantaged in the way in which we operate. And so that's some of the for me, the nuggets that I wanted to share today, is that let's reimagine the function of risk and sustainability as an advisory and a proactive function towards building organizational resilience, and not so much as the police function that tends to follow fix whatever's breaking and continue to put in place processes that will try to manage people's behavior. And again, I said that the thing that we must not forget is that an organizational development process is anchored by its people. And so what kind of investment are you making in your people as enablers for the kind of risk innovation that you can see manifest? What kind of investment are you making in your people to ensure that they've got digital skills? What kind of investment are you making in your people to ensure that they've got skills for a digital future? And so these are all the things I think that for me must inspire risk practitioners in a modernizing and a digitalizing context to truly reimagine the risk function towards being an advisory function from an organizational point of view. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much, Mr. Skinjani. I don't even want to spoil what you just said. You took everything out of every risk practitioner's mouth, basically. What you're advocating, We are standing for that. We are saying exactly what you are saying. And we are grateful that you are with us in preaching this gospel. We are honestly thankful and honored by what you said. And I love the fact that you also brought out the digitalization part of it, you know, in risk management, because I think it's the future. That's where it is going. It is about time that we interrogate with the data, you know, data analytics, so we can provide intelligent reporting as well in moving forward. And maybe that will assist us as a competitive edge, maybe to management, so they can see our worth in moving forward as we advise them. Thank you so much for that insight presentation. We are now reaching the part where we'll be dealing with the panel discussion. It will be facilitated by Ms. Lorraine Smith, who is also a deputy chair for the Eastern Cape IRMSA committee. I will hand it over to you. Please don't forget to participate in our survey. Check your chat box. Please press that. Give us a feedback so we can improve in moving forward. Lorraine, this is your time. Please take us through the panel discussion. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Bridget. And it's been really a wonderful morning listening to everyone and all the insights here this morning. So thank you very much. I've been taking notes of some of the questions that we've had this morning. And I have the first question, I believe, for Chris. For Jeremy Baxter, I suppose, from the investors, if Chris is not here. The first question is, will the recent ratings agency downgrade and suspected downgrades in the year ahead adversely impact the projected 2-year recovery period earmarked for the South African economy? I think we can take that one first and have a discussion surrounding that very important issue. Okay, I think we might have.
Lauren?
Yes.
Pardon me, I didn't hear a word you said.
Oh, yeah.
I hear you, but you're very, very faint. I can hardly hear a word you're saying. I hear a voice.
Okay, thank you. I will check that up now. So just do we have Chris Holbrook back on the system?
Could you put could you be closer to your mic, perhaps? It's almost as if you're not reaching your mic.
Wow. Is that better?
Much better.
Oh, great. Thank you. Sometimes I have to put in a little ear card. Wow. So the first one is for Chris Holbrook. Is he back on the line? Bridget or Ross?
He's not back on the line with us.
Okay. Well, I think then we can start with, let's start with an ethics question. And the question comes to, and it says, compliance attitude is there are 3 challenges for both ethics and risk management. What are the practical means to do away with this? The compliance attitude with respect to both ethics and risk management. How practically are we going to do away with that? And I think this one is probably an ethical question for Lorraine as well as for Professor Fox. Thank you very much, panelists. I'll let you take that. We'll start with Lorraine and then maybe through to Fox.
All right, Lauren, I'm still struggling with your sound quite badly, but I did read the question. So, Peter, do you want me to go ahead with that one? Okay, great. Yes, yeah. The compliance attitude, I know it extends beyond ethics. From a practical point of view, which is where I like to focus my energy, is I have focused a lot on education and awareness. So it comes a lot through training. And I think that's where my personal challenges have come through the online forums. I've developed a lot of training things to highlight the differences and highlight what, you know, where these challenges come in, where you have a compliance mindset, and where that will trip you up. So a lot of what we've done is in that sphere. However, you've got to get your foot in the door to do that, because you've got to get it aimed at the right people. So that's one of the big challenges in achieving it in that way. The other challenge with that is you can't do it once. You've got to keep the conversation going. You know, to do it once, a person will go, oh, wow, you know, that has just really opened my eyes. And then they get caught up in everyday business once again. And I think that's where the drive of these board committees becomes so important. You know, in the organizations where your social and ethics committee, your board and your audit committees, SHE and risk committees, where they put a lot of pressure on management to approve the substantive part of their ethics programs or compliance or whatever it is that you might be talking about, where they put a lot of pressure on the substantive part of things, is where you start seeing the benefits and the gains.
So to add to Lorraine's submission, Lauren, this is at the core of why we have so much of corporate governance failure and corporate collapse. This question from Homba is so relevant, the compliance dilemma. You will find that the average CFO and the average CEO and the average guardian of compliance, the chairperson of the audit and risk committee, propagate a culture that lacks a fundamental tenet of compliance management. And that tenet is professional skepticism. So what one has to lift to a board level is more rigorous debate around these issues. What you've got is a truly, this person says, Homba says, the question says compliance attitude. I'd like to submit, it's a compliance culture. What we need is a culture of professional skepticism. Turn this thing on its head. And to achieve that, to share with stakeholders, not just shareholders, that no matter what we tell you, the money is right, no more questions. When the money is right, ask more questions. So we need to start promoting a compliance, rather a risk governance culture as part of corporate governance that promotes the context of why we are doing this and why we are skeptical. Because we're going to get a hiding. There are corrupt people out there. Let's see if they exist in this case. No board does that. Boards start with this assumption. Everything is roses. We are very ethical. I'm sad to say the numbers tell us otherwise. Thank you, Lauren.
Can pass the mic back to Bridget for a short while.
Thank you for passing back to the mic. Not so sure, maybe Lauren might have had challenges with the connectivity and the sound, it was not quite clear. Rox, not so sure, did you manage or capture all the question, or should we take hands rather now and allow the interaction with the colleagues on the floor?
Bridget, there is a question on the Q&A that refers to ratings agencies downgrades, and I think Safiso did comment that he'd like to take that question.
Oh, yes. Can I read it loud for him? Will the recent rating agency downgrade and prospective downgrades in the year ahead adversely impact the projected 3-year recovery period initially embarked for the SA economy?
Short answer is yes. And I think there's an interesting conversation that we must look at what's happened in the last 2 years with respect to the ratings agency as well as the National Treasury and our South African Reserve Bank. Simply, the ratings agencies have stopped believing the story that's coming out of National Treasury. We look at last year, the National Treasury revised our growth estimates about 7 times in the year. And also what started to happen 18 months ago is that we saw inflation trending down. And often what happens is that when inflation is trending down, your cost of borrowing must trend, usually follows suit, right? So your long-term bond yields often follow the inflation trajectory because that speaks to what your cost of capital will be. What we saw is a decoupling of that. We saw inflation going down and cost of borrowing going up. What that usually means is that the market and investors have stopped believing the fact that the cost of borrowing, that the risk profile of the economy is going down, and that in fact, the reason inflation is trending down is because there's a lot of demand compression that's going to follow, which means that the economy itself is about to get even more pressured. And therefore, when there's no demand, prices don't often rise. And so they were pricing in that the inflation trajectory that we're seeing is going to be more a function of demand compression, which means the economy is going to continue ailing, and not because we are fulfilling our mandate of price stability as coming out of the Reserve Bank. And so what's then happened is in the language that they've been using when they're talking about the downgrades, they said in essence they don't believe that our growth trajectory is believable at this point. And this is why, and when we look at these numbers, we must look at it with the right kind of lens, right? When you say debt to GDP, that's a fraction. It's debt over economic growth. The more your economic growth doesn't come to the party, the more that fraction gets bigger. And so we must contextualize and just say it's not just a borrowing number as a function of output, but understanding the context in which there's no output growth. And the pressure points coming from South Africa specifically is that we don't have breadth from a corporate tax collection point of view. Very quickly to round it up is that we have about 3.2 million corporates registered through SIPC in South Africa. We had about 814,000 of those. This is on December tax statistics, even pre-COVID. 1,814,000 of those companies that had, were assessed for tax. Only 204,000 of those had positive taxable net income, and only 380 companies were attributable for 60% of our tax collection. What that's telling you is that you've got a concentration risk within our corporate tax base, is that when one big organization like an EDCON, for example, fails, the impact that it has on our tax collection base is actually going to be very, very big because of the concentration that only 380 companies are attributable to 60% of our corporate income tax collection. And so we've also seen that corporate income tax collection declining over the years, and now I think it's about 16% of the entire collection base. And so we've got a challenge where organizations are not growing. We've got a challenge where the economy is not growing, and therefore it needs to finance its expenditure program through debt. And therefore we're going to expect, in the February budget that those numbers are going to be revised. And I think the debt ceiling is going to be moved further up. And what that suggests is that the recovery process for South Africa is going to be slower and more painful. And I think that's also then, I think, exhibited in the statements that are coming out from the ratings agency, as well as the extent to which they emphasize inequality as a big risk item for the sustainability of our economy. And so I would certainly suggest that what we're seeing now as numbers that are published are probably going to look worse when we go into the February State of the Nation and budget speech early next year.
Thank you so much, Mr. Skenjan, for the response. I will then move to the next questions that came. Professor Pista Gause, the Zondo Commission as a catalyst for bringing about accountability for rampant corruption and fraud. Is it credibility still intact, especially after the last few weeks?
I'm afraid, and I had some strong views in the general media, you can Google some of those views, when the commission was formed. I'm afraid that the term accountability and the Zondo Commission, I'm afraid they don't go together. Let me clear that. Commissions of inquiry gather what we call evidence and information that will educate accountability. Let me just make that clear. So the report will say, I think there was state capture, I believe there was state capture based on witnesses, and I believe that this is the form of the state capture. For example, the report might say that. The report will even say who was implicated in the state capture. Here's the challenge. That commission can bite not even ice cream. It is toothless. So it will recommend accountability. It will say prosecute so-and-so. It will say take corrective action against so-and-so. It will say, I doubt it will say consider recovering of losses from so-and-so. I doubt it will go that far. It will say consider civil action rather. So it is not an accountability structure. Now, as for its credibility, one area is whether it can hold people to account. Challenge number one. Challenge number two, you say credibility today. The walking out from the commission, the political posturing during the commission that's been allowed, the humoring of people who refuse to answer questions, the blatant disrespect for the commission that's been shown, and the commission's errors in requesting subjective views too often. These are the issues that are going to create a credibility challenge for the commission. Notwithstanding the big challenge that has already been tabled that a person who walked out, that they could keep, they said this to the commission, we could keep you busy in the courts for a very long time. So the credibility of the commission is on a fine edge. And I think the sooner they issue a report, in my opinion, the sooner they will restore that credibility. I said earlier on in my work, I was drawing from the US where during the Mueller inquiry, the special counsel in the US was appointed to look at the election allegations of electoral fraud during Trump's appointment originally. I said early on, drawing from there, I said, if this commission could produce interim results, and we could have interim prosecutions, interim recovery of losses, the commission would have had a lot more reliability and been seen to be holding people to account. We've been talking for 3 years now. I think the question of accountability is losing the confidence of South Africans.
Thank you, Prof. It is indeed unfortunate. I will then move to the next question until Lauren gets back. It seems to be struggling with her connection. It's been up and down. But I've got another question that has been raised by Mr. Fass. It's directed to the panel, anyone who would want to take the question. What are your views in collaboration between programs within a department and also between one department and the other? What benefit would be drawn from the collaboration? I hope the question is in line with the collaboration within the department and intergovernmental collaboration, especially looking at the fiscals that we are having now more than ever. Over to you, panel. I'm not so sure who's comfortable to take it first. Thanks.
Okay, I'll take a stab. So interestingly enough, some years ago, one of the articles I wrote in the market was that we had a policy cohesion challenge, and very simply is that you've got an industrial policy framework called IPAP, and that talks around, in essence, really it says capital first, and then you have the NDP, which says labor first, simply, right? And I'm really kind of simplifying the lack of cohesion within those policy frameworks. And then what that meant is that if you follow the money, that's what I used to say, is that if you see where IDC has spent the money, you see that it was largely non-labor intensive sectors and more capital intensive sectors. And you're saying that if where the money is going is not aligned to the imperatives of the NDP, will we ever meet the needs or the aspirations of the NDP? And it's the same light then that I've also, I think, 2 years ago, written about how we've got to look at particularly local government as a network industry. And the reason I say that is that agriculture won't work if there are no roads. Logistics and transport won't work if there are no roads. And so roads are, as a function of local government, for example, are material enablers for the function of other sectors in the economy. And so what we need to do is that if we start having a systems view around what are the real network industries within the context of our economy, and so I said local government is one, and then understanding then if local government is a network industry, how does that align to the agricultural strategy, right? And so if agriculture as a strategy saying that we want more agribusiness, we want higher yield crops coming out, and so where are those crops going to come from? If we've got 84% of our cargo going on roads, how does that contextualize to the sector strategy for transport and rail, etc.? So once we start to see the network context of these departments and where they overlap and where they have material dependencies on each other, I think it will be very valuable in knowing how to collaborate. I think the challenge as we see it now is that I don't think there's clear context in how to evaluate because everyone's almost running their department as a separate P&L. And so I think that's really the opportunity around true collaboration at an intra-departmental level as well as an interdepartmental level. One of the things, as I said earlier on, is also, I think, harmonizing the KPIs and the risk and the metrics that are used across departments, right? And so when we do monitoring and evaluation, we put those monitoring and evaluation toolkits or frameworks in place. How do those harmonize with other departments? Because it can't be that our M&E framework for one department is different to another. And so I think all of those things will enable, I think, a better single view of the governmental function, as well as then the dependencies that go across all government function. And I think that's the kind of thing that we ought to be looking at to ensure that there's better collaboration intra-departmentally as well as interdepartmentally.
Thank you very much, Mr. Skijana, for the response. I will now head over to Lauren. She is back. I hope the connection and the sound will be better, but please do indicate through the chat box if you do not hear properly. Lauren, please, the stage is yours.
Bridget, it seems we have not been able to resolve Lauren's sound issues.
Okay, let me step up again a little bit when the sound is being resolved. I'll move to the next question in the interest of time. I've seen Antonella's question regarding two issues of ethics. Let me just read it as it is. If ethics is embedded in the culture of the business, when we will see good decisions that are normally good for the whole of the society and the business. Do you think business sufficiently tests ethical culture when hiring people?
Okay, so that's a great question. The recruitment of people into organizations forms one of the interventions when you look at an ethics management program. And it's an essential part of an ethics management program. Do people do it? Yes. Do they do it well enough? I don't think so. And I think that a lot of ethical failures could be prevented if it was done correctly. Peter, I think you might be able to even add on there. I think a lot of economic crime in organizations could have been prevented if the correct background checks were simply done. So yes, letting people in is very important, because that is one of the things that destroys the culture of an organization. And once that person's in the organization, it's incredibly difficult to get rid of them. I just want to check that I have answered that full question.
Thank you. I've got one question before I let you go that is being asked about engaging. I hope it refers to hiring actually the ethics officer. What will be his or her day-to-day task? The fear is to underwork someone, and giving them that big, beautiful package. Just to share a little bit, when they are engaged in the process of hiring an ethics officer, what ideally will be their day-to-day activity? Thanks.
All right. So it would be very dependent on your organization and the size of your organization. Obviously, when we're talking about influencing culture, it's much easier to influence the culture of a small group of people versus a huge multinational organization with various sets of laws, sets of customs, etc. So it's very dependent on that set of circumstances. The organization that I left a few years ago operated across 36 different countries. So it had a unique set of circumstances, and we had to have an office of 5 full-time people. But generally, the duties of an ethics officer range from conducting you have to look at the governance structures within the organization and integrating with those. And then just day to day, it's policy work, working on the code of ethics and all the ethics related policies. So there's policy work. It's the development and implementation of an ethics strategy, an ethics management program, which involves the development and implementation of training. It involves, I'm remembering off the top of my head here, it's training, awareness, a lot to do with whistleblowing, and that involves quite a bit of work. There's monitoring, there's reporting. So yes, but it is important at this point to say that it is unique to each organization. A banking institution's ethics officer will be different to an agricultural sector's ethics officer. Somebody based in Germany will look different to somebody based here in South Africa. So it's generally quite unique, but they would work along ethics management framework. But I can assure you there's little chance of being under-engaged. There's plenty to do when it comes to ethics management.
I can imagine. Thank you so much, Lorraine. We're having back Lauren. Are you back? Can you continue with the question? She's been changing from device to device.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Bridget, and thank you for everyone for your patience. I hope this third device is the one that you can hear me on.
We can hear.
Yeah, I see nodding heads. That's a very good sign. Thank you. This is a lovely question. In every risk, there's an opportunity, which is what we as risk practitioners believe. And this one is actually for Chris Holdsworth. Do you believe that retailers will now look at purchasing more of their product locally? And do you believe that this will change the economic landscape, or is it a subject to interpretation? I hope you heard that.
I did. Yeah, we're starting to see it already. You know, we need to recognize that these things do go through cycles. About a decade or so ago, there was a shift from retailers to source goods outside of South Africa for various reasons, linked to labor, quality control, etc. And it was just simply cheap to get it in from China. But what we're seeing of late is a shift back to SA, partly because you're able to be more nimble. So if you don't want a product line of 10,000 items that are exactly the same, you want 100 items, then it's more feasible to do that locally. And with this sort of demand for instant goods and for more bespoke items, we are starting to see that. So it's happening already. And retailers are no fools. They respond to these sort of trends very rapidly, for one. So that's one side of it. On the other side, if you look at the cost of labor in China, it's no longer as cheap as it once was, for various reasons. The cost of wages have gone up, productivity has gone up, and that means elsewhere has become more competitive, elsewhere including South Africa. So there's a change from both sides. First of all, it's a cost perspective, and secondly, it's meeting demand of clients. But yes, they're on top of it, and they're shifting already.
Thank you very much. Do any of the other panel members want to add to that? Have some thoughts in terms of purchasing more from South Africa?
Yeah, I mean, I can quickly. I mean, so there's often what we speak of as the revealed comparative advantage, and that really speaks to what goods are you able to produce at the lowest opportunity cost, and therefore makes you more competitive produce that good in a global marketplace. And so when you saw import intensity increasing, particularly in the labor intensive sector. And so what we talk about import intensity is how much you need to import just to sustain domestic demand for the South African economy. We saw that actually increase from as early as about 1996, after, in essence, our 5-year window into the World Trade Organization transition actually lapsed. And then we were forced to reduce our tariffs, for example, in textiles from about 74% all the way to about 20%. And that resulted in a lot of, for example, the textiles industry coming under a lot of cost pressures. So what we need to understand is then how does that RCA, this reveal comparative advantage, change over time? Where it changes, you start to see the demand shifting from one place to another. And so the point Chris is making is that now our RCA in certain labor intensive sectors is increasing because we are starting to, we are creating labor, or we're costing labor at a relatively cheaper rate than some of the other economies, if we can call it that. And I think what's going to be more important around how we continue to look at that is how do we look at that as actually as a competitive advantage or competitive pressure point for the economy, so that we don't fixate on localization for the sake of localization, but we're actually specific about what must we localize in a way in which it will enable us to be competitively advantageous. And so I think we also, as we're saying, that we saw news flow even coming in today around how retailers are insourcing a little bit more. But I think one other point that is also critical around this localization is probably around some of the things that we saw. Pre-COVID, about 66% of the medical equipment was imported from 3 countries, right? And we saw what it did to the health resilience of economies. And so now economies are starting to say, even if we don't have a high RCA in health equipment, we will still spend in localization of that just so that we make sure that we've got health resilience in our economy. And so those are the other things that are key considerations in how you choose to localize and what we may see as a trend of localization, particularly in medical manufacturing goods that we're going to see in the country.
Okay, thank you very much. Right, I have another question that came through for Chris, and that is printing money is a time bomb and invariably will lead to demand pull inflation later on when the economic stimulation is required. Is printing money the right solution for the economic strategy?
Yeah, so first of all, I agree with the point made by the person asking the question. Actually, we've got a lot of history on this. So you can actually go back to ancient Babylon if one wants. There's 400 years of record of the price of wheat, and you can see the impact of increase in money supply on the price of wheat and how it's spiked up as Alexander brought in treasures from elsewhere. We can see it in Europe as well when the Spanish were bringing in gold from South America. So there's a lot of theory on this up until now, and we've got a lot of history. So typically that is the case, an increase in money supply typically leads to inflation. Having said that, there are some subtleties. One of which is, in some cases, if you've got credibility, you can get away with it for some time. So if we were to say we're switching on the printing presses, that would lead to huge questions being asked. But the US can get away with it. And there are a few other countries that can get away with it too. They can get away with it for some time. And then get away with it for as long as there is demand for dollars in the US. So in an environment where there is flight to safety and there's demand to sit on dollars, then you can increase the supply of dollars because no problem, because there's demand for dollars. The issue is once you get back to normal levels of growth, once the vaccine is out and once this pent-up demand is released and people get out, well, then you no longer have the demand to sit on dollars, but you still have the supply. And that is what the issue is. And then ultimately at that point, the central bank in the US will have a very tricky problem to solve. They will have to reduce the money supply or they will land up with inflation. That's conventional theory based on several hundred years worth of history. And unless we're wrong on that. But the evidence suggests that we're not wrong on it up until now. And it's all up to the Fed to gauge how carefully people are getting back and demand is picking up and how carefully they reduce money supply. And they have got a very tight rope to walk on.
Okay, thank you very much. Right, the next one is an ethical question. And I heard a quote the other day and a little story, and I just loved this story, so I'm going to share it with you. The person's called into, and I'm sure you've heard this, Lorraine, many times, this quote, but it was the first time I heard it the other day. A man was called into the principal's office with his son, and the father said, why? Yes, Lorraine's heard this. I'm sure a lot of people have heard this, but for those one or two that haven't. And he's called into the office with his principal's office with his son, and the father says to the principal, what did my son do? And the principal said, he stole a pencil from his fellow pupil. And the father said, son, why didn't you tell me? I could have taken one from the office. So I always love that. But it goes to the next question, and it's been a question that we have discussed earlier, but it's how do we actually instill ethical behavior in society? Lorraine, and how is it going to make a difference? How do we convince a person what's right and wrong if they haven't actually been taught that from their childhood?
All right, well, that's the objective at the end of the day in everything to do with ethics. All right, so our main focus, because, we need to eat, is organizational ethics. But the concept broadens. So if you look at, we know the bell curve. The bell curve is the one that we all talk about. But in any group of people, you have a small minority who will always do the right thing. all right? And you have a small amount of people who, no matter what you do, will always do the wrong thing. And in the middle, we've got what the Ethics Institute calls decent but dubious people, all right? When we start talking to, you're talking about the morals, what you have and haven't been taught as in your childhood, etc. There's certain universal rules of how we interact with each other. Okay, so we might have religious things that differ. We might have certain customs that are different, but how we treat each other, there are certain accepted norms, your basic morals of how we interact. And this is where it becomes very, very important. Your decent but dubious people, which is everybody in the middle, will do what's convenient. So it becomes about using every bit of influence and the modeled behavior in your environment to influence the majority. Okay, this is why it's hard in an organization to work on ethical culture versus thou shalt and thou shan't. You know what I mean? All right, so this is where it becomes about influencing organizations and letting that message spread to your wider community. All right, this is why the behavior of government becomes so important, and having role models who are demonstrating the correct behavior. So if you look at it very simply, it's throughout. What do households look like? What do organizations look like? What does your community look like? What does your government look like? All right, so that's what will influence the behavior. How do you achieve that? The answer to me is quite simple. Each person is responsible for their own behavior. And it's quite cliched, but the message that I'm always sending out is I is the start of integrity. All right, it's the first letter in integrity. Each one of us can easily sit back and rationalize. Well, why should I follow the rules? Why should I do the right thing? Look at what is happening around me, all right? And that just becomes the broken window syndrome. Well, nobody else is doing it, why should I? Nothing will ever change that way. And it's really about setting the example around you. Each one of us is a leader for those around us. It sounds so simplified, but while we're always pointing fingers around us, nothing will change. It's about the holding people to account. I think sometimes the way we hold our leaders to account might not always be the best way, but more and more pressure is being put on for things to change. And I think we've got to keep doing that. I was, if you look at executive pay right now, that movement started while I was still working in corporate, directly in corporate. It started in just after 2008, about executives are being paid excessively. And now I see that the shareholders are starting to vote against this excessive payment in organizations that are underperforming. So it takes time, but change can be brought about by the actions of everyday human beings. So yes, it's difficult, but we've got to do our part. And we've got to start becoming aware of our own behavior rather than pointing fingers. And it's difficult. I faced it now during lockdown, suppose it's not the ethical thing to admit to, but I am a smoker. And lockdown, I bought enough smokes when they made the announcement to last me quite a while. But I had to face the fact I could see the packets going lower and the lockdown getting longer. And I had to confront this situation of, I'm a person who always vowed I would never support the illegal cigarette trade. Now, am I going to compromise my values and ethics? Is most addiction stronger? And do you understand what I'm saying? We always have to question our own behaviors. So yes, it's very influenced by the greater community, our environments, but essentially it boils down to the decisions we make each and every single day.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Right, there's 2 more questions and then I've been told to wrap up. So the second last question is for Chris. You mentioned in your presentation that there's high probability of food price inflation increasing significantly. This does not bode well for a country like ours, where poverty has grown at alarming rates during the last year as the economic impact of COVID was felt. Assistance from the fiscus in the form of relief measures are highly unlikely, but from an economic standpoint, what are the options available for us as a country as this becomes reality?
They are fairly limited. We can attempt to distort prices through caps, but those never really work. We can allow for imports from the rest of the world. The issue there is global food prices are increasing as well. So the global maize price is up about 20% year on year, and it's up about 20% in South Africa too. So that's not really going to help a hang of a lot. We can reduce tariffs on the imports. We still have tariffs on wheat imports, so that could help a bit. Alternatively, you just need to provide support for the poor and the very poor. So those that are on grants, typically they will receive an inflationary type increase or slightly above. And that's really the best that we can do. In terms of the full basket, food accounts for about 15% of the basket. Inflation at this point is just over 5.5%, it's 5.6%. And the first thing that we'll see is that food producers won't be able to pass on the full cost. So the soy price is up 40%. The cost of meat or pigs or pork rather in shopping centers is not going to go up by 40%. So they're going to wear some of it themselves. They will try to pass on some of that. And the bit that they pass on, we can try this best through supporting the poor, but there's very little else we can do. Once you start distorting the prices in shopping centers through caps and that sort of thing, you cause all sorts of issues, shortages amongst them, and that's probably worse to deal with. So these cycles come and go. We land up with periods of higher food and price inflation, periods of low food and price inflation. We think we're heading into one of higher. It is uncomfortable. It does cause all sorts of issues. And the reality is that we don't have many tools at our hand to help in that situation, aside from allowing cheaper imports from the rest of the world. But I say that's a bit of an issue as it stands. So yeah, there's not much that we can do.
Well, thank you very much. And the last question is for Sifiso. Just in terms of how can you directly measure the impact of COVID and the effect of COVID on the economy versus what the economy would have done had there not been COVID?
That's a pretty tough ask. I mean, I think we can follow what the trajectory was pre-COVID, and we can look at a number of metrics and see, I guess, our sense. So again, as I said, is that we were already in recession pre-COVID. We had seen a spike in January on credit default spreads, which is in essence the investors modeling our ability or our propensity to default on our debt, which in essence was talking about the quality of our debt. And so I think they were already seeing that we are in a very unhealthy space. We had pre-COVID construction was in 7 consecutive quarters of negative growth, and that's a labor-intensive sector. We had seen only horticulture growing from an agricultural point of view, but field crops still feeling quite a bit of pressure. And again, that's another labor-intensive sector. We've seen manufacturing continuing its decline. I mean, it used to contribute about 28% of GDP in 1996, and it now contributes about 11.5 or so. We're seeing that declining as well. And so we're already seeing a big decline in the productive base of the economy. And again, you know, we've got to diagnose the South African problem really well. It's because we often say, just grow the economy, jobs will follow. But well, we've seen 12, 13 years of jobless growth. And when we also saw a recovery post the financial crisis, when jobs started recovering, earnings didn't recover as well. And so, you know, and that's why what we call when you look at some of the numbers of people who are employed but underemployment. So this is what we call underemployment in South Africa. We're about 700,000 people who are underemployed, and so the people who are overqualified for the roles that they're occupying. And so what it meant again is that the economy has become disillusioned with the supply of the labor force as well as what in the kind of labor it demands. And so there was always, I think, a cliff that was coming for a South African economy pre-COVID. I think what COVID has done is that it's just exposed those fault lines more emphatically. And so the structural issues to growth for South Africa have not changed. You know, the challenges that are informed by the multidimensional poverty that we see. And so multidimensional poverty talks to poverty as a function of earnings, as a function of nutrition, healthcare, schooling. All of those metrics have been getting worse over the years. And I mean, now the official rate of unemployment in the Eastern Cape is 50%, right? It's 1 in 2 people. I mean, that's like, it's quite scary when you think about it in that way. And so all of the developmental metrics, particularly social and human development metrics, have been getting worse over time in the context of our economy, because I think we're structurally constrained from growing. And so I think until we diagnose the problems correctly, we won't position ourselves for growth. And so I think a pre-COVID South African context hasn't really changed in terms of the structural issues informing our decline as what we've seen post-COVID. It's just the magnitude, I think, that's changed more importantly, more emphatically. But again, issues of digital divide, the issues of inequality are going to be there. As I mentioned, the labor issue, as well as the output multiplier issue. In fact, if I just quickly sum up, some years ago, for every rand of GDP, we would get about 1.6 worth of output. This is roughly about 15 years ago. And now for every rand of GDP expenditure, well, we're getting close to about 0.8. And so it shows that our expenditure is not matching up to the needs, the labor needs of the economy. And so I think it really speaks to the fact that we are currently structurally constrained to grow, and we've got to diagnose what those structural levers or structural releases need to be to truly start to bring people, and particularly young people, into the economy. And I think those are, for me, the things that we really need to be spending more of our time focusing on, and ensuring that we can partially position the economy for some kind of recovery. But I do think it's going to be a tough season for us for the medium term.
Well, thank you very much. And unfortunately, that's all the time we have for questions today. I do want to say thank you very much to all the speakers who've made time to join us today and give us their expert advice and information on their relevance points. I think the key takeaway for me is that if we don't manage risk and find the opportunity and to really grow and improve the situation, we will end up in a very unethical situation, which will end up being Peter Goss's will be doing more forensic investigations, and the economy will be worse. So we really, as risk management professionals, we need to find the opportunities in the risk. And the challenge is to go back and make that good risk governance culture a reality. So thank you very much. We need to say thank you very much to the Eastern Cape Provincial Treasury for sponsoring this session, and to all of those that have joined. And of course to the Institute of Risk Management for coming to the Eastern Cape and seeing that we really need your institute to come in and do what you need to do to help risk management officers within the Eastern Cape. We've heard the unemployment rate is 50%, and we need the opportunities to be made here. So thank you very much. The session will be made available via recording, and it will be emailed to every participant here. And we wish you a happy December and a safe December, and all the best until the next Institute session. So watch your emails and your text messages for the next session here in the Eastern Cape. Thank you very much to everyone that's been involved today.